She had everything the world said should make a woman happy. And she was quietly disappearing. A billionaire woman, a penthouse above the clouds, a fiancé who smiled for cameras and broke things behind closed doors. On the worst night of her life, she didn't call the police. She didn't call her lawyer. She called a man she barely knew, because he was the only one who had ever looked at her like she was a person, not a trophy. What happened next would change both their lives in ways neither of them saw coming. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay with me until the very end. The rain came down like it had a grudge. It wasn't the soft, cinematic kind of rain that romantics write poems about. This was November rain, the kind that soaked through your coat in 30 seconds flat, the kind that turned the streets of Manhattan into dark mirrors reflecting nothing but headlights and the occasional blur of someone running for cover. The kind of rain that made the whole city feel like it was trying to wash itself clean of something it couldn't name. Jackson Reed had been sitting in traffic for 22 minutes. He didn't mind, actually. That was the thing about him that most people in his world never quite understood. He didn't mind small inconveniences the way other billionaires did. He didn't tap his fingers. He didn't check his watch every 30 seconds. He just sat there behind the wheel of his black Aston Martin, watching the rain slide down the windshield in crooked little rivers, thinking about whether his daughter had remembered to take her allergy medication that evening. Emma, 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, completely convinced that their golden retriever Biscuit understood every word she said and simply chose not to respond out of stubbornness. Jackson smiled to himself at the thought. The charity gala behind him had been exactly what he'd expected. A room full of expensive people performing generosity for each other while waiters circled with champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's rent. He had smiled the right smiles, shaken the right hands, written the check that would look good in a press release, and gotten out as fast as politely possible. He always did. He was 3 blocks from the venue when he saw her. Victoria Sterling was standing under the narrow awning of a closed jewelry boutique, her silver evening gown completely soaked through from the knees down, one heel slightly sunken into a sidewalk crack. She had her arms wrapped around herself, not the way someone stands when they're simply cold, but the way someone stands when they're trying to hold themselves together from the inside out. He almost drove past. He would think about that later, how close he came to just driving past. Instead, Jackson pulled over. He rolled down the passenger window and leaned across the center console. Victoria. She turned. For just a fraction of a second, so fast he almost missed it, her face showed something raw and frightened before she assembled the familiar expression. The polished smile. The composed posture. The look of a woman who had spent years making sure no one ever saw beneath the surface. Jackson. Her voice was steady, practiced. What a coincidence. You okay? He didn't ask it the polished way people at galas asked it. He asked it the way you ask when you actually want an honest answer. Something flickered in her eyes. I'm fine, just waiting for my driver. Your dress is soaked. I'm aware. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him with that careful, neutral expression that probably worked on everyone else. Jackson had seen that expression before, not on Victoria specifically, but on his sister's clients, women who had learned to make their face a wall. Get in, he said. I'll take you home. You don't have to. Victoria, get in the car. She hesitated. That hesitation, 3 full seconds of it, told him more than anything she'd said. A woman confident in her situation doesn't hesitate. A woman who is safe doesn't stand in the rain calculating whether she can trust someone enough to accept a ride. She got in. The first few minutes were quiet except for the rain on the roof and the low murmur of the radio. Some late-night jazz station playing something slow and melancholy. Jackson merged back into traffic without pushing for conversation. He'd learned years ago that silence, offered without pressure, was sometimes the most generous thing you could give a person. Victoria sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the city sliding past outside her window. Up close, under the intermittent glow of passing streetlights, she looked different than she did in photographs or across ballrooms. The careful makeup couldn't completely hide the shadows beneath her eyes. There was a tension in her jaw, the kind that comes not from stress about a meeting or a deadline, but from a deeper, older kind of exhaustion. The gala ran long, she said finally, as if filling the silence felt safer than leaving it. It always does. He paused. Where does Marcus think you are right now? The question landed quietly between them. Jackson hadn't planned to ask it. It just came out. Marcus Vane, her fiancé. A man Jackson had met perhaps a dozen times at various functions, always impeccably dressed, always the loudest laugh in the room, always with one hand resting possessively on Victoria's lower back like she was a painting he owned. Victoria didn't answer immediately. Her hands, still folded in her lap, tightened slightly. He thinks I left with Eleanor Dowd, she said. We told him we were going back to Eleanor's for a nightcap. Jackson nodded slowly. He didn't say anything. He just let that sit. I should... She started, then stopped. Started again. Can you just drive for a bit? Not toward my apartment. Just drive. He glanced at her. Yeah, sure. He took the next turn away from the Upper East Side and headed toward the West Side Highway, which would be mostly empty at this hour. The city spread out on their left, the Hudson dark and wide on their right, the rain still hammering everything. They drove in silence for a while. Jackson turned the radio down but didn't turn it off. The jazz continued, low and undemanding. I'm sorry, Victoria said quietly. For what? For being strange. For asking you to just drive. You don't owe me. I've got nowhere to be, he said simply. Emma's with my mother tonight. I've got time. Another silence. Longer this time. Then quietly, so quietly he might have imagined it, I don't know what to do. Jackson didn't react visibly. He kept his eyes on the road. About what? She was quiet for so long that he thought she'd decided not to answer. Then, I need somewhere to go that isn't home, and I don't have anyone I can call. That's a strange thing to realize. How many people I know and how completely alone I actually am. He didn't rush to fill that with reassurance. He just listened. I have a publicist. I have lawyers. I have a board of directors and an assistant who manages my assistant. A short, humorless breath. And I'm sitting in the rain at 11:30 on a Thursday night trying to figure out where I can go where I won't have to answer questions I don't know how to answer. Jackson was quiet for a moment. I know a place, he said. The Blue Anchor Diner had been open since 1987 and showed no particular signs of wanting to update itself. The booths were the original vinyl, patched in places with mismatched tape. The overhead lights were slightly too bright. The laminated menus were sticky at the edges in a way that suggested decades of coffee rings. The pie case by the counter rotated slowly, displaying 3 kinds of pie with the quiet confidence of an institution that had outlasted several trendier establishments on the same block. It was the most normal place Jackson knew how to find at midnight in Manhattan. He had discovered it 3 years ago, after a particularly brutal board meeting, when he'd needed somewhere to sit that felt absolutely nothing like his life. He'd been coming back ever since, usually alone, usually late, always grateful for the fact that nobody there cared who he was. The waitress, her name tag read Donna, looked up when they came in, clocked their evening wear with mild interest, and said, Anywhere's fine, hun. Coffee? Please, Jackson said. 2, Victoria added, and her voice had shifted slightly. Softer, less constructed. They slid into a corner booth. Donna brought coffee without ceremony and disappeared back toward the counter, where a man in a transport company jacket was eating eggs and scrolling his phone, entirely unbothered. Victoria wrapped both hands around her mug. She stared into it for a long moment. I don't know how to start, she said. You don't have to start anywhere in particular. She looked up at him. In the diner light, too bright, unflattering, honest, she looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with being up late. It was the exhaustion of someone who had been performing composure for so long that the performance had started to cost more than she had. Marcus, she stopped, tried again. People think I'm lucky. I know they do. I see it. This life, the money, the engagement, the whole picture of it. She paused. They don't know what happens when the cameras go away. Jackson didn't move, didn't prompt, just waited. The first time She set her coffee down very carefully, like sudden movements might undo something she was holding together. It was almost 2 years ago. We'd had an argument about nothing, about some event I'd attended without telling him first, and She pressed her lips together briefly. He grabbed my arm. hard enough to leave marks. And then he was so sorry, so genuinely devastated, I almost believed it was a one-time thing. The diner hummed around them. The coffee machine gurgled. The man in the transport jacket turned a page. "It wasn't a one-time thing," she said flatly. "No," Jackson said quietly. "It never is." She looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read, something between surprise and relief, as if she'd expected him to say something complicated and he hadn't. "He's never hit me. I keep telling myself it's not bad enough to justify—" She stopped. "That's what he says. That I'm dramatic. That what he does isn't that bad. That other men are worse. That I should be grateful for what I have." "That's not a relationship," Jackson said. "That's a management strategy." Something shifted in her face, a slight crumbling at the edges of that composed expression. I know that in my head, but knowing something and being able to act on it are very different things, especially when—" She paused. "He has things over me. He knows things. About my business, about decisions I made years ago that I'm not proud of. He's made it very clear that if I try to leave, he'd use them against you." "Yes." Jackson turned his coffee mug slowly in his hands. Outside, the rain had eased slightly, from a downpour to a steady drum against the diner window. He was thinking carefully, not about what to say. He wasn't trying to construct the right response, but about what was true. "What happened tonight?" he asked. "Specifically tonight." Victoria breathed out slowly. "He called me during the gala. I stepped into the hallway to take it. He wanted to know who I'd arrived with, who I'd been talking to, whether I'd spoken with any men he didn't know about." She picked up her coffee again. "That's every event we attend. Every one. A call or a text, sometimes both. Sometimes he sends someone, an assistant supposedly, but I know why they're there. He monitors you. Constantly. What set tonight off?" I answered the phone and I was too slow to pretend. Her voice was very quiet now. He heard it in my voice. He said— She paused, her jaw tight. "He said some things about what happens when I embarrass him, about the kind of woman he thought he was getting and the kind of woman he got instead. And I was standing in a hotel hallway in a $30,000 gown listening to this, and I thought—" She stopped. The pause went long enough that Jackson didn't try to fill it. "I thought I could just not go back. I could just walk out into the rain and not go back." "So you did." "So I did." A breath that was not quite steady. "And then I didn't know where to go." They stayed in that booth for 2 hours. Donna refilled their coffee 3 times without being asked, and had the particular wisdom of someone who had worked a late shift in a New York diner for many years. She kept her distance and her expression neutral, and asked no questions whatsoever. Jackson listened more than he talked. He asked careful questions, not the kind designed to extract information, but the kind that showed he was paying attention. He didn't try to summarize her experiences back to her or tell her what she should feel. He didn't tell her she was brave. He didn't immediately jump to solutions. At some point, Victoria said, "I don't understand why you're doing this." "Sitting with you? Any of this? You don't know me very well. We've talked at events, we've been in the same rooms at the same parties, but you don't owe me anything?" Jackson considered this honestly. "No," he said. "I don't." "So why?" He turned his coffee mug again. It was something he did when he was thinking through an honest answer, rather than a polished one. "My sister runs a counseling center. For women in situations like yours. I've been around this enough to know what it looks like when someone needs someone to just be present. No agenda. No solutions being pushed. Just present. You think I'm like her clients. I think you're a person who's been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and who just told the truth out loud for what might be the first time in years. That's not a category. That's just a human thing." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Your sister, does she work with women who have money?" "She works with women," he said simply. "Money doesn't make it better or worse. It just changes the particular shape of the cage." Something in Victoria's expression broke slightly at that. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies, but in the small, real way that happens when someone says something that cuts exactly to the truth you've been trying not to think about. cage, she repeated softly. That's what you said earlier, that you didn't know where you could go. That's not a relationship. That's a cage. She looked out the window. The rain was easing. The street outside was dark and quiet. The occasional taxi hissing through a puddle. The city doing what the city does at 1 a.m, breathing, existing, indifferent. I'm scared, she said. Not dramatically, just as a statement of fact. Of leaving? Of everything that happens when I do. She turned back. Marcus isn't stupid. He has resources, people who work for him who are loyal to him in the way that money buys loyalty. If I leave without a plan, without being... She paused. He'll come after me. Not violently, necessarily. He'll come after my reputation, my business. He'll make sure it costs me more than I can afford. Let me ask you something, Jackson said carefully. Right now, tonight, not about tomorrow or the plan or how it all shakes out. Just right now. Are you safe? She considered that. If he doesn't know where I am, yes. Does he know where you are? Eleanor's covering for me. She thinks... A brief, complicated expression crossed her face. Eleanor thinks I just needed space. She doesn't know the full picture. Does anyone know the full picture? The look she gave him then was answer enough. You're the first person I've told, she said. I've never said it out loud to anyone. Not once in almost 2 years. They left the diner at 12:47 in the morning. The rain had pulled back to a drizzle, the kind that was more feeling than sound. The street smelled like wet concrete and distant exhaust, that specific New York smell that people from the city always recognize the moment they step off a plane coming home. Victoria stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and Jackson watched her looking up at the sky in a way that felt less like looking at the sky and more like taking a breath she'd been holding for a very long time. Where are you going to go tonight? He asked. Eleanor's, I think. I told Marcus that's where I'd be. If I change the story now, he'll... She stopped. I'll be careful. Jackson reached into his jacket pocket and found one of his cards. Not the business cards his assistant ordered in bulk, but the personal ones. Just his name and a cell number that almost no one had. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a second before taking it. That's my cell, he said. Not the office line. Not my assistant. My phone. If you need to go somewhere and you don't know where to go, call that number. She turned the card over in her fingers. Jackson. No strings, no expectation, just a number. He paused. My sister's center is called the Meridian. It's on the Upper West Side. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just telling you it exists. She looked at him for a moment with that same difficult-to-read expression, the one that had something breaking beneath the composure. Thank you, she said finally. The way she said it was not performative. It was the particular kind of thank you that comes from a place that doesn't get accessed very often. He nodded. Get somewhere warm. He waited until she'd gotten into the cab he'd flagged before he walked back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. The rain tapped against the roof. He thought about what she'd said. I've never said it out loud to anyone. Not once. He thought about the way she'd held her coffee like it was the only warm thing available. He thought about the gap between the woman the world saw, Victoria Sterling, one of the most powerful women in American business, photographed at every major event, praised in every profile as brilliant and composed and formidably successful, and the woman who'd been standing in the rain on a sidewalk at 11:30 at night, trying to calculate whether she could trust someone enough to sit in their car. He started the engine. The radio came back on. Different station now, no longer jazz, just some late-night talk show host making jokes about the weather. Jackson turned it off. He drove home through the wet, empty streets, passing the city that never quite slept, the bodegas still lit and open, the restaurant workers heading home from late shifts, the insomniacs walking dogs, the whole nighttime city doing its ordinary, extraordinary thing. He checked his phone at a red light, a text from his mother. Emma's asleep, dog is asleep on her feet, everything fine, stop worrying. He set the phone down. Everything fine. He thought about that for a long time on the drive home. Victoria Sterling did not sleep that night. She lay in the guest room of Eleanor Dowd's apartment. Eleanor had asked no questions, had simply led her to the room, said, "I'm here if you need me," and closed the door with the particular tact of a woman who knew when not to push, and stared at the ceiling in the dark. She still had the card. She'd put it in the inside pocket of her evening bag, which was sitting on the nightstand beside her. She was aware of it the way you're sometimes aware of a small object that carries disproportionate weight, a key, a letter, something that represents a door you haven't decided whether to walk through yet. She thought about what she'd said in the diner. She had not planned to say any of it. She had not planned, when she stepped into Jackson Reed's car, to say anything beyond polite small talk about the gala and the rain. She had said it anyway. Something about the way he'd asked, "Are you okay?" not as a social formula, but as an actual question, had cracked something open. She thought about what he'd said. That's not a relationship, that's a management strategy. She thought about how long she had spent constructing arguments for why her situation was manageable, how she had become an expert at finding reasons why leaving wasn't possible. Marcus's connections, his threats, the information he held over her, the carefully calibrated fear she felt at the thought of what he might do to her reputation, her company, the thing she'd spent 15 years building from nothing. She'd been using these reasons the way a person uses a wall, to hold something back. And she'd been using them so long she had almost stopped noticing that the wall was also keeping her in. At 3 a.m, she got up and went to the window. The rain had stopped. The street below was clean and dark, the wet pavement reflecting the orange of streetlights in long, distorted streaks. A lone cab idled at the corner. The city was as quiet as it ever got. Victoria looked at her own reflection in the window glass, superimposed on the street scene below, faint and transparent, a ghost of herself looking back. She thought, how did I get here? Not in the apartment, in the life, in the relationship that had closed around her so gradually that she hadn't noticed until the closing was nearly complete. The first year with Marcus had been extraordinary. That was the true and terrible thing about it. It had been genuinely extraordinary. He was magnetic and brilliant and attentive in a way that had felt, at the time, like being truly seen. He'd wanted to know everything about her, where she grew up, how she'd built her company, what she was afraid of, what she wanted. She had told him. That was the thing she hadn't understood until much later. The questions hadn't been interest. They'd been reconnaissance. He'd used everything she told him, every insecurity, every ambition, every fear. He'd filed it away and then, over months and then years, deployed it with surgical precision. Told her she was brilliant and then told her she'd made a mistake anyone would catch. Told her she was beautiful and then asked why she'd worn that dress, whether she was trying to attract attention. Built her up and dismantled her, so regularly and completely that she'd stopped being able to tell, from moment to moment, which version of herself was real. The worst part, the part she found most shameful, though she was trying to stop thinking of it as shameful, was that she had not left when it started. She had found explanations. He'd been under stress. He hadn't meant it that way. She had probably misread the situation. She was sensitive, probably too sensitive. Wasn't that what he said? Yes, that's what he said. She turned away from the window. She sat back on the edge of the bed in the dark. She picked up the evening bag and took out the card. Jackson Reed. Just his name and a number. Plain card, simple font, nothing performative about it. She sat with it in her hands for a long time. Then she lay back down, still holding it, and eventually, somewhere around 4 a.m, she slept. Jackson woke up at 6:15, as he always did before his alarm. He lay in bed for a few minutes in the quiet of his apartment. His apartment was on the 42nd floor of a building on the west side of Central Park, which meant that on clear days he could see the park spread out below. And on nights like last night, he could see the rain moving across the city in dark curtains. He'd lived here for 4 years. He'd bought it after his marriage fell apart, when he'd needed somewhere that was entirely his and Emma's and nobody else's. Emma was at his mother's until Sunday. The apartment was very quiet without her. He made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the park come back to light in the gray November morning. The rain was gone. The trees in the park were bare, branches like dark cracks against the sky, the last of the autumn color washed away by last night's storm. He thought about Victoria. He was careful with himself about what he thought, because he knew the shape of easy narratives and he didn't want to fall into one. He hadn't done anything heroic last night. He'd given a woman a ride and sat in a diner and listened. Those were small, ordinary things. The extraordinary part was hers. Whatever it had cost her to say what she'd said to someone she barely knew, in a too-bright diner at midnight. He'd meant it when he'd said no strings. He had no expectations of where last night led. He'd given her the card because he wanted her to know the option existed, not because he was trying to insert himself into her situation as the solution to it. He knew enough, from his sister, from the women he'd seen come through the Meridian over the years, to know that the timeline of getting out of a situation like Victoria's was rarely simple or swift. It wasn't a decision made once and then executed cleanly. It was a process, full of backward steps and second thoughts and returns and recalculations. And the worst thing someone on the outside could do was make that person feel like they owed them progress. He wasn't going to do that. He drank his coffee. He went to his desk and worked for 2 hours on quarterly reports that he'd been putting off because ordinary things needed doing regardless of what happened the night before. His phone didn't ring. That was fine. That was how it should be. At 9:15 in the morning, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. He almost always let unknown numbers go to voicemail. And then didn't. Read. A pause. Then, it's Victoria. Her voice was different from the night before. Less the careful composure, less the practiced steadiness. There was something rawer in it. Something that sounded like someone who had been awake all night and had finally decided something. "Hi," he said. Simple. No rushing. "He came to Eleanor's," she said. "This morning, at 7. He wasn't violent. He didn't do anything, but he was..." She stopped. "He stood in Eleanor's hallway, and he was very calm and very cold, and he said, 'I needed to come home, and we needed to talk.' That's always..." Another pause. "When he says we need to talk that calmly, it's..." "You're still there?" "At Eleanor's." "Yes. He left, but I..." Her voice was not quite steady. "I don't know if he'll come back, and I don't know where to go, and I..." A breath. "I'm calling because you said to call." "I did," he said. "Give me 40 minutes." He was there in 35. He pulled up to Eleanor's building on East 74th Street, and Victoria was waiting outside with a single overnight bag and the same evening bag from the night before. Her expensive gown exchanged for a simple coat and dark jeans that she'd presumably borrowed from Eleanor. She looked smaller somehow. Not in a defeated way, in the way a person looks when they've stopped holding themselves at performance height. She got into the car without saying anything for a moment. Then, "I feel like I'm being dramatic." "You're not," he said. He didn't actually... "Victoria." His voice was calm and even. What he did this morning, showing up, standing there, being calm, the whole thing, that's not normal. That's meant to make you feel like you're being dramatic. That's how it works. She was quiet. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Not to fix anything. Just somewhere safe where there are people who understand this better than I do. Is that okay?" She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face was very tired and very clear at the same time. The particular clarity that comes after a long night of deciding. "Yes," she said. "Okay." He pulled out into traffic. The city moved around them, going about its unremarkable Friday morning. Delivery trucks, school buses, runners in the park. The whole ordinary machinery of a day that didn't know it was the first day of something for two people sitting in a car heading uptown. The heater ran. Outside, the November sky was gray and cloudless and very still. Victoria looked out her window. Jackson drove. The Meridian wasn't what Victoria had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected, exactly. Something institutional, maybe. Fluorescent lights and plastic chairs and a receptionist behind bulletproof glass. Some visual confirmation that she had crossed into crisis territory, that this was the kind of place where serious damage got processed. Instead, Jackson pulled up to a brownstone on West 83rd Street that looked like somebody's home. 3 stories, red brick, window boxes with late-season herbs still hanging on. A small bronze plaque beside the door that read, "The Meridian Center," in letters understated enough that you could walk past it 100 times and never notice. "This is it?" Victoria said. "This is it." She looked at the building for a moment. "It doesn't look like..." "That's intentional," Jackson said. "My sister didn't want it to look like a facility. She said the moment it looks institutional, women start feeling like patients instead of people. Victoria nodded slowly. She didn't move to get out of the car immediately, and Jackson didn't push her. He'd learned that lesson somewhere along the way, that the moment just before a person crosses a threshold they've never crossed before requires a particular kind of patience. You don't rush it. You just stay present. Your sister, Victoria said. Does she know I'm coming? I called her while you were getting your bag at Eleanor's. What did you tell her? That a friend needed somewhere safe and someone to talk to. He paused. That's all. The rest is yours to tell or not tell, however you want. Victoria looked at the brownstone again. A woman came out the front door, mid-40s, carrying a canvas tote bag, moving with the purposeful stride of someone headed somewhere specific. She glanced at the car without interest and turned up the street. Okay, Victoria said quietly, more to herself than to him. She opened the door and got out. Jackson followed. Claire Reed was 40 years old and looked like someone who had heard a lot of difficult things and was still standing. She had her brother's calm, the same quality of genuine attentiveness, but it lived differently in her, layered over years of professional training and thousands of hours sitting across from women whose lives had come apart in specific and terrible ways. She met them in the small front office, which had been decorated with the obvious intention of not feeling like an office. Actual furniture, a worn leather couch, 2 armchairs that didn't match, a low table with a ceramic bowl of river stones on it, books on real shelves, a window that looked out onto a small enclosed garden, leafless in November but carefully maintained. Victoria, Claire said, extending her hand. Not Ms. Sterling, not a title, just the name. I'm Claire. I'm glad you came. Victoria shook her hand. She looked around the room briefly, and Jackson saw the same thing happen that had happened in the diner. That slight shift in her posture when she encountered a space that wasn't asking anything of her. I'll leave you too, Jackson said. Victoria turned. Something crossed her face, quick, almost imperceptible. She was not someone who showed need easily, and she clearly didn't want to, but for a fraction of a second the thought of being left in an unfamiliar room with an unfamiliar person registered. I'll be right outside, he said. The front steps, as long as you need. She nodded. You don't have to. I know. He said it plainly, without making it a big thing, and stepped back out into the hallway. Checked. He sat on the front steps for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He'd brought nothing with him. No laptop, no work he'd planned to handle on his phone, nothing to fill the time. He sat on the worn stone steps of the brownstone and watched West 83rd Street do its Saturday morning thing. A man walked a very old basset hound that moved with the philosophical slowness of a dog that had made peace with its pace. A kid on a bicycle wove between parked cars. A woman came out of the building across the street carrying a recycling bin and dropped it on the sidewalk with a crash that startled pigeons off 3 different rooftops. Jackson watched all of it without really seeing it. He was thinking about Emma, partly. She'd called earlier from his mother's apartment. He'd taken the call before coming inside, stepping away so Victoria couldn't hear. And she'd spent 6 minutes telling him an elaborate story about how Biscuit had tried to steal a piece of toast off the counter, but had knocked a glass of orange juice over in the process, and was now, in Emma's assessment, hiding under the bed out of embarrassment. Dogs don't feel embarrassment, Bug, he'd said. You haven't seen his face, Dad. He'd laughed for the first time in about 18 hours. He was also thinking, sitting on those steps, about the particular way the morning had gone. About Marcus Vane showing up at Eleanor's apartment at 7 in the morning with that calculated calm that Victoria had described. He was very calm and very cold. And what that said about the man. Jackson had dealt with enough people in business to recognize the difference between genuine composure and performed composure. Genuine composure comes from not being rattled. Performed composure is the weaponization of stillness, the deliberate choice to be very, very controlled precisely because it is more frightening than being loud. He knew which kind Marcus Vane had. Claire came out at 11:43. She sat down next to him on the steps with the ease of someone completely comfortable with the absence of ceremony and said, without preamble, "She's in good shape, considering." "Considering," he said. "She's been managing something very heavy for a long time, alone." Claire looked out at the street. "She's smart. She's already analyzed a lot of it. She understands the mechanics of what happened to her better than most people do this early." The problem is, there's a gap between understanding it in your head and being able to act on that understanding. That gap is full of fear, and the fear is legitimate. What does she need? Time, mostly. A therapist she trusts, which I can help with. A safety plan, which we started today. Claire paused. And she needs to not go back to that apartment alone. Jackson looked at her. She said she was going to. I know what she said. I'm telling you what I think. Claire turned to look at him directly. I'm not asking you to fix it, Jackson. I know you well enough to know that's already where your head went. I'm just telling you the situation. He was quiet for a moment. Is she staying here today? She wants to think about it. That's normal. Claire stood up, brushed off the back of her coat. She asked about you, actually. What about me? She wanted to know why you stayed. Claire gave him a look that was partly professional and partly the look of a sister who had known him his whole life. I told her I'd been asking you that question since you were 12, and I still didn't always have the answer. He didn't say anything to that. Claire went back inside. Victoria came out 20 minutes later. She sat down next to him on the steps. The same way Claire had, without ceremony, without announcing it. She was carrying a paper coffee cup that someone inside had given her, and she looked, Jackson thought, like someone who had just put down a suitcase they'd been carrying for a long time. Not lighter exactly, still tired, but different in some way that was hard to specify. She's good, Victoria said, meaning Claire. Yeah, she is. She wants me to come back Tuesday for a session with a therapist she recommends. Victoria turned the coffee cup in her hands. She also said I shouldn't go back to my apartment today. What do you think? I think she's right. A pause. I think I've known for a long time what the right thing to do is, and I've been very creative about not doing it. She looked at the garden across the street, a small bare one behind an iron fence, a few frozen rose bushes with their canes tied up for winter. Marcus knows Eleanor's address. He knows most of the addresses in my life. She stopped. I need to think about where I can actually be that he doesn't immediately know about. I have a place, Jackson said. He said it before he'd fully thought through whether to say it, and then, because he believed in honesty more than he believed in strategic self-editing, he kept going. My company has a corporate apartment on the west side. It's been empty for 2 months. We use it for visiting executives, but there's nobody there right now. Completely secure building. Marcus has no connection to it, no reason to know it exists. Victoria looked at him. No strings, he said, same as the night before. I'll give you the key, the address, and the door code. That's all it is, yet a safe place to be while you figure out next steps. She looked at him for a long moment with that measuring expression, the one he'd noticed the first night, as if she was running a calculation, trying to determine whether the offer was what it appeared to be or whether there was something underneath it. Why do you keep doing this? She asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Keep doing what? Offering things without wanting anything back. She shook her head slightly. In my world, nobody does anything without wanting something back. I've been doing business for 15 years, and I can count on one hand the number of people who operated without a secondary agenda. Jackson thought about how to answer that honestly. I'm not going to tell you I don't have my own complications, he said. I've got plenty. My marriage fell apart 4 years ago, and I still haven't figured out all the ways that changed me. I work too much, and I'm not always present with my daughter the way I want to be. And there are probably 10 people in my life who would tell you I have a habit of focusing on other people's problems because it's easier than my own. Victoria looked at him. But this isn't that, he said. This is just, you needed somewhere safe, and I know somewhere safe. That's it. She was quiet for a moment. A bus went past on the street, heavy and slow, rocking in its own slipstream. Okay, she said. Thank you. She spent one night in the corporate apartment before Marcus found out she wasn't at Eleanor's anymore. Jackson didn't know exactly how Marcus found out, whether through someone on Eleanor's staff who talked or through some other thread he'd been pulling, but at 8:15 on Sunday morning, Victoria called him from the apartment with a voice that had that particular quality of controlled fear, the kind where you're keeping yourself calm specifically because panic won't help. He called me, she said. He knows I'm not at Eleanor's. He doesn't know where I am, but he... She stopped. He said some things about what happens next. About what he'll do to my company if I don't come home. Jackson was already up, already dressed. He'd had Emma back since yesterday afternoon. She was still asleep down the hall, Biscuit curled against her feet the way he always was. And he was in the kitchen with coffee, trying to decide how much of this he should be inserting himself into. Did he threaten you directly? Not in a way that would... Nothing I could take to the police. He's too careful for that. He talks in implications. Her voice tightened slightly. He said he'd been very patient with me and that patience has limits. He said I was making a decision that I'd regret and that he hoped I understood what I was putting at risk. Okay. He kept his voice level. Are you safe right now, in the apartment? Yes. He doesn't know where I am. Keep it that way. Don't tell anyone the address. He paused. Call Claire. She needs to know this happened. I know. A beat of silence. Jackson, yeah. I'm sorry for pulling you into this. You didn't pull me into anything. I stepped in. He said it without drama. Call Claire. I will. He set the phone down on the counter after she hung up and stood there for a moment with his coffee, looking at nothing in particular. Then he heard the particular sound of small feet and a dog's nails on hardwood floor, and Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, the ones with the small dinosaurs on them that she'd been wearing since they were slightly too big and were now slightly too small, holding Biscuit by the collar with the proprietary air of someone escorting important company. Biscuit needed water, she announced. Biscuit can find his bowl, Jackson said. He wanted company. Right. Emma looked at him with the particular perceptiveness that 7-year-olds sometimes have, and that Jackson had never quite stopped being surprised by. You look worried. I'm fine. You do the thing with your coffee when you're worried, where you hold it but don't drink it. He looked down at his coffee. She wasn't wrong. Go back to sleep, Bug. It's Sunday. She considered this assessment, determined it was valid, and retreated with Biscuit in tow. He heard her bedroom door close softly. He stood in the kitchen for another minute and then pulled up Claire's number and sent her a text. Marcus called Victoria this morning. Threats? Implied. She's okay, but you should know. She'll call you. Claire's response came back in under a minute. Already on it. Stay out of her decisions. Be available if she needs you. Don't try to be the solution. He looked at that last line for a second. He typed back, I know. He wasn't entirely sure that was true, but he was trying. That. By Monday morning, the situation had escalated in the specific, controlled way that powerful men with resources escalate things when they feel they're losing. Victoria called Jackson at 9 a.m. She was becoming comfortable enough with calling him that she no longer spent 30 seconds on formalities before getting to the point, which he took as a good sign in itself, and told him that Marcus had sent his lawyer a letter over the weekend. The letter didn't threaten her directly. It was addressed to her business counsel and outlined in very precise legal language several areas where Marcus alleged she had engaged in conduct that, if examined closely, could create significant regulatory and reputational exposure for her company. None of it was fabricated outright. That was the particular horror of it. The issues he cited were real. Decisions she'd made years ago, in the early days when she was building the company, when she'd cut corners she wasn't proud of, when she'd moved fast in ways that hadn't always been strictly clean. Not criminal, not the kind of thing that had made her lose sleep since, but documented, and now pointed at her like a weapon she'd handed him herself. She was sitting in the corporate apartment with her business lawyer on one phone and Jackson on the other, and he could hear in her voice the exhaustion of someone who had been playing defense for so long that they'd forgotten what offense felt like. He said this would happen, she said to Jackson, between calls. He told me early on that I'd made decisions that would destroy me if they came to light. I didn't understand at the time that he was filing it away. I thought he was confiding in me about my vulnerabilities because he wanted to help me protect them. He was building leverage, Jackson said. I know that now. Her voice had a bitterness in it that sounded new. Not the quiet despair of the diner, but something more active, more angry. He thought that was probably a good sign, even if it didn't feel like one. He's very good at it. He builds leverage on everyone around him. It's how he operates. He probably has files on half the people in our social circle. Okay, Jackson said. What does your lawyer say? She says the exposure is real but manageable, that none of it rises to the level Marcus is implying, but that fighting it would be expensive in public and could damage the company's stock price regardless of the outcome. A pause. She asked me whether there was any way to resolve this privately. Meaning, go back. Silence. Victoria. I know, she said. I know that's not... She stopped. He knows exactly which button to push. That company is... I built it from nothing. My father told me I'd never run anything bigger than a lemonade stand. The first investment I raised was $30,000 from a man who made me cry in a conference room first, just to see how I'd respond. That company is... I know, he said quietly. I know what it is. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing, not crying, just sitting with something difficult. There's something else, she said. Tell me. He's been at my apartment building. The doorman told my assistant, who told me. He's been there twice since Friday, just standing in the lobby, talking to the staff, being charming and concerned about his fiancée, who seems to be having some kind of episode. Her voice had a flat, controlled quality that was covering something not flat at all. That's what he told them, that I was having an episode, that he was worried. Jackson felt something tighten in his chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. Somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. He's building a narrative, he said. He's very good at building narratives. She paused. Jackson, I know you've done more than you should have already, and I don't want you to think I'm making you responsible for... Stop apologizing for needing help, he said. It came out more direct than he'd intended, but he didn't walk it back because it was true. Needing help isn't a flaw. You've been convinced for 2 years that asking for anything is weakness. It isn't. A long silence. Your sister said almost exactly the same thing on Saturday, Victoria said quietly. We had the same mother. Apparently it sticks. He heard something that might have been the first almost laugh he'd gotten out of her, small and brief and real. Claire's counseling center had a protocol for situations like Victoria's, situations where leaving wasn't just emotionally difficult but strategically complicated, where the person leaving had significant resources of their own, but those resources were entangled with the person they were leaving, where the conventional advice didn't account for the specific textures of the particular prison. Claire had seen it before. Wealth didn't protect women from abuse. In some ways, it complicated leaving because the shared financial and legal and social entanglements were more complex, and because powerful abusers had more sophisticated tools at their disposal. Marcus Vane wasn't going to show up and put his hands on her in a way that left visible evidence. His version of control was documentation and leverage, and the slow, methodical dismantling of a person's confidence in her own judgment. Claire told Victoria this on Tuesday during their first formal session, and Victoria looked at her with an expression that was partly grief and partly the strange, terrible relief of having something named correctly after a long time of having it go unnamed. That's what gaslighting does, Claire said. It doesn't just make you doubt your perceptions. It makes you doubt your competence, your judgment, your right to make decisions. And when you've built an entire career on your judgment and your competence, someone systematically undermining that it's very specifically destructive. He used to tell me I was brilliant, Victoria said. It came out with a particular inflection. He'd say it right before he explained why I'd made a mistake. The compliment was, it was to raise me up enough that the subsequent drop would land harder. Yes, Claire said simply. That's exactly what it was. Victoria stared at the window. The same garden Jackson had looked at from the front steps, bare and wintered down. I keep thinking I should have seen it earlier. That question won't help you, Claire said. Why you didn't see it earlier, why you stayed as long as you did. The answer is that you're human, and he was skilled, and the circumstances were what they were. Spending energy on that question is spending energy looking backward. The more useful question is what you need to move forward. I need my company to be safe, Victoria said immediately. No hesitation. It was the most certain she'd sounded in days. Okay. What else? A pause. Longer this time, as if the question had more layers than the first one. I need to stop feeling like I'm falling, she said finally. I felt like that for 2 years, like the floor keeps shifting. I want something that feels solid. Claire nodded. We can work on that. She made a note. It takes time. I won't tell you otherwise, but it's possible. I've seen it. The women who come here, Victoria started. Some of them are doing extraordinarily well, Claire said. Some of them are still working through it. Everyone's timeline is different. She paused. But they're all here. They all got out. That part happened. The confrontation came on a Wednesday. Jackson found out about it after the fact, from Victoria, who called him at 2 in the afternoon with a voice that was shaking in a way he'd never heard from her before. Not with fear exactly, but with a kind of adrenaline aftermath, the particular tremble of someone who has just been through something and is still processing the fact that it's over. She had gone back to her apartment, not to stay, but to get clothes, her laptop, documents she needed. She'd told Claire she was going, had arranged for Claire's colleague to go with her. She'd timed it for 11 in the morning when she believed Marcus would be in a board meeting across town. He wasn't in the board meeting. He was in her apartment when she arrived. He'd let himself in with the key he still had, the one she hadn't yet thought to change because she'd been managing everything else and hadn't gotten to that. He was sitting in her living room when she walked in, and her first sight of him. Calm, dressed impeccably, a glass of water on the coffee table in front of him like he lived there, which, until recently, he effectively had stopped her cold in the doorway. Claire's colleague, a woman named Dana, who was specifically trained for exactly this kind of situation, had put her hand on Victoria's arm from behind and said quietly, "You don't have to go in." But Victoria had gone in anyway. He was calm, she told Jackson. That's the thing. He was absolutely, completely calm, like he was waiting to have a reasonable conversation. And he told me, her voice tightened. He told me he wasn't angry with me. He said he understood I needed space, and he'd given me that space, and now it was time to come home and sort this out like adults. He said the business thing, the letter to my lawyer. He said that wasn't a threat. That was just his own lawyer doing due diligence. That if I hadn't overreacted, it would have never gone anywhere. Did you believe him? Jackson asked. A short, sharp exhale. For about 30 seconds, I almost did. That's the honest answer. She paused. He does something with his voice. It's very even and very reasonable, and it makes the inside of your head get very quiet. And for 30 seconds, I could feel myself starting to think maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe this was manageable. Maybe... What stopped you? She was quiet for a moment. Dana, she said. Dana was behind me, and she said very quietly, just loud enough for me to hear, "You don't owe him an explanation. Just that. 4 words. Jackson waited. He destroyed the lamp, Victoria said, when I told him I was leaving and I'd be in contact through my lawyer. He picked up the lamp. It's ceramic, big, heavy, from my trip to Portugal 2 years ago, and he threw it at the wall. Not at me, just at the wall. And then he looked at me and said, very quietly, 'Look what you made me do.'" The line went briefly silent. "Victoria," Jackson said. "I'm okay. We left. Dana was... She handled it. We were out of the building in 3 minutes." She paused. "But he just... The lamp, and then, 'Look what you made me do.' Like the lamp was my fault." Her voice had something in it that was past shaking now, something harder underneath it. "I've been hearing that for 2 years. Everything that went wrong was something I'd caused. Every time he..." She stopped. "I am not responsible for his lamp." "No," Jackson said. "You're not. I know that." A breath. "I know that. But I needed to say it out loud." "Say it again if you need to." She made a sound that was short and slightly unsteady, but had the shape of a laugh. "I'm not responsible for his lamp." "No, you're not." "He's going to escalate," she said, and her voice had shifted back to the practical, analytical register she used when she was managing something. "Dana said this is a pattern. The thing this morning, that was a loss of control. He's been very controlled up until now, and he slipped. She said that's both a warning sign and a change in the dynamic." "What does she recommend?" "Filing a police report. Not because it'll necessarily go anywhere, but because it creates a paper trail. A record that this happened, that there was a witness." She paused. "I'm going to do it. I already decided." "Good." She stopped, started again. "I just wanted to tell someone who wasn't Claire or Dana or a lawyer, someone who wasn't going to respond professionally." Another pause. "Is that strange?" "No," Jackson said. "That's just being human." March 2. He picked Emma up from school that afternoon. She came out of the building in a yellow backpack that was significantly larger than necessary for a second grader, wearing a hat she'd put on herself and therefore slightly sideways. And she walked to the car with the specific confidence of a person who had figured out where they were going. She got in, dropped her backpack on the floor, and said without preamble, "Chloe said her dog had 12 puppies." 12 seems like a lot, Jackson said. It's a lot. I told her Biscuit has no puppies, and she said that was sad, and I said it wasn't sad. He just has different life goals. Jackson pulled out of the school pickup line. Where did you get life goals? You say it. He glanced at her sideways. She was looking out the window with the serene expression of someone who considers the conversation closed. He felt, as he sometimes did at moments like this, a complicated surge of something, love and pride, and the specific anxiety of knowing you were responsible for a small person's entire understanding of the world and not always being certain you were doing it right. How was school otherwise? Fine. We learned about weather systems. She turned to look at him. Did you know that rain is just water that went up and came back down? I did know that. It's been doing it for millions of years, she said. The exact same water. Like the rain last Thursday could have been rain in ancient Egypt. Could have been. She considered this for a moment. I think that's cool, she decided. Everything comes back around. He drove through the gray November afternoon, the same streets he'd driven 3 nights ago in the rain, the city looking different in the flat afternoon light. Less dramatic, more ordinary, just a city doing what it did. He thought about everything that had happened in the space of a few days. About a woman who'd stood in the rain not knowing where to go. About a lamp thrown at a wall. About Dana saying you don't owe him an explanation. About the tremble in Victoria's voice and then the harder thing underneath it. Dad, Emma said. Yeah. Can dogs feel embarrassment or not? For real? He thought about Biscuit and the toast incident. I genuinely don't know, Bug. I think they can, she said firmly. I think Biscuit can. He didn't argue. He wasn't going to win that one, and some things were fine to leave unresolved. That evening, after Emma was fed and homework was done, and Biscuit had been walked and she'd been read to and eventually, with some negotiation, gone to sleep, Jackson sat in his kitchen in the quiet of the apartment and thought about what Claire had said on the steps of the Meridian. Don't try to be the solution. He'd been turning that over in his mind for days. He understood what she meant. He'd seen it, in the abstract, with enough of her clients over the years. The person who shows up with resources and good intentions and inadvertently makes the woman he's trying to help feel like she's moved from one kind of dependency to another. He'd been careful about that. He'd tried. But there was something else Claire hadn't said directly, that he was only beginning to understand. He was not unaffected by this. He'd been telling himself these past several days that this was simply a thing he was doing for someone who needed help, that it was clean and bounded and separate from his own life. That was mostly true and also not entirely true, because watching someone find their footing after being deliberately unsteadied, watching it, being adjacent to it, was doing something to him that he hadn't anticipated. He hadn't been close to anyone in 4 years. Not really. He'd been present for Emma and for his business and at the edges of his social world. But close, the specific vulnerability of being actually close to another person, he'd moved away from that after his marriage ended, quietly and without making a big declaration of it, just gradually reducing the radius until he was in a space he could manage. Victoria wasn't asking him to change that radius. She wasn't asking anything of him except exactly what he'd offered. But something was shifting anyway, without being asked. He sat with that for a while in the quiet kitchen. Then he finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, and went to check on Emma. Still asleep, one arm thrown over Biscuit's back, her gap-toothed mouth slightly open, her sideways hat somehow still on her head. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The rain from earlier in the week felt very far away. The city outside was quiet. Everything that needed to get done today had gotten done. It wasn't fine exactly. There was too much unresolved for fine, but it was manageable, and sometimes manageable was enough to go to sleep on. He closed Emma's door softly and went to bed. The police report was 3 pages long and took 4 hours to file. Victoria had not expected it to take that long. She'd expected something more. Efficient, maybe. A form, a signature, an officer who wrote things down and sent her on her way. Instead, there was a waiting room with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights. A detective who asked her to start from the beginning 3 different times in slightly different ways, a moment where she had to describe the lamp incident in specific detail, and found herself using words like ceramic and approximately 14 inches as if she were testifying at a deposition, which in some ways she supposed she was. Dana sat beside her through all of it, not talking, not managing, just there. The particular presence of someone who has learned that showing up and staying is sometimes the whole job. When it was over, they walked out into the cold afternoon, and Victoria stood on the precinct steps and breathed the November air and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not relief exactly, but a kind of solidification, like something that had existed only in her own experience had been written down, given a case number, made real in a way that the world outside her head could now acknowledge. "That was harder than I thought it would be," she said. Dana nodded. "It usually is. Does it—" She paused. "Does it typically go anywhere?" "The report." "Sometimes," Dana said honestly. "It depends on what he does next. But what it definitely does is exist. The next time something happens, there's a record that this happened first." Victoria looked out at the street. A woman was pushing a stroller past, completely absorbed in her phone, steering by some unconscious autopilot. 2 kids in school uniforms were arguing over a bag of chips, the completely ordinary middle of a Wednesday afternoon. "Okay," Victoria said. "Okay." She called Jackson from the cab on the way back to the corporate apartment. He answered on the second ring, and she told him it was done, and he said good. And there was a pause in which neither of them said anything, and that was fine too, because by now they had built the kind of conversational rhythm where silence didn't need filling. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Not as a formula." "Tired," she said. "Really tired. But it's a different kind of tired than before." She looked out the cab window at the city sliding past. Before, it was the tired of holding something up all the time. This feels more like the tired after you've finally put the thing down. "Yeah," he said. "That's a different thing." "How's Emma?" The question surprised her slightly as it came out. She hadn't planned to ask it. It had just arrived as the natural next thing to say, and that naturalness surprised her. She had not been in the habit of asking about other people's children. She hadn't been in the habit of a lot of things that were starting to feel ordinary. "She's good. She's currently convinced that Biscuit understands Portuguese." "Why Portuguese?" "I don't know. I stopped asking why about a month ago. It's a more peaceful way to live." Victoria laughed. It was a real laugh. Not the social function laugh she'd spent years deploying, but the actual slightly ungraceful thing, surprised out of her by a 7-year-old's logic. She noticed it, that laugh, the way you notice something that's been missing. December arrived the way it always did in New York. Not gradually, but suddenly, as if the city had flipped a switch. The holiday decorations went up on Fifth Avenue overnight, the skating rink in Bryant Park opened, the whole machinery of collective seasonal performance cranked into gear. People walked faster and were somehow simultaneously more festive and more irritable, which was a specific New York balance that newcomers always found confusing. Victoria noticed none of it at first. She was in what Claire called the processing phase, which was less dramatic than it sounded and more exhausting. It meant that things she had kept carefully compartmentalized for 2 years had started coming apart at the seams, not in controlled ways, but in the ways that things come apart when you stop actively holding them together. She would be fine, working, thinking clearly, and then a song would come on in a coffee shop, or she'd smell a particular cologne on the street, and the bottom would drop out of her for 10 seconds, in a way she couldn't always predict or prepare for. Claire told her that was normal. "You spent 2 years in high alert mode," she said during one of their Tuesday sessions. "Your nervous system doesn't know it's over yet. It's still scanning. The goal right now isn't to stop the responses. It's to get better at recognizing them for what they are. A memory, not a current threat." "It doesn't feel like a memory when it's happening," Victoria said. "No, it feels like now. That's how trauma works. It collapses time. The goal is to learn to reorient, to look around and confirm where you actually are." Victoria was getting better at that. Slowly, with setbacks. One Thursday, she had a session with her lawyer about the regulatory issues Marcus had raised. Her lawyer had done thorough research and confirmed that while the exposure was real, it was manageable with some proactive disclosure and restructuring, that Marcus's implied threat had been significantly larger than his actual leverage. And Victoria had come out of that meeting and sat in the lobby of her lawyer's building for 20 minutes before she could stand up. Not because the news was bad, because the news was good, and she hadn't known how much of herself she'd been spending on fear until the fear was reduced and she felt, suddenly, hollowed out. She texted Claire afterward. "Good meeting. Don't know why I can't move." Claire texted back, "Because your body prepared for impact, and then the impact didn't come. Give it 20 minutes. It took exactly 22 minutes. Then Victoria stood up, straightened her coat, and walked out of the building into the cold December afternoon. And she bought a coffee from the cart on the corner and stood drinking it on the sidewalk and watched a man in a Santa hat arguing with a parking meter. And she thought, I am here. This is now. That is a man arguing with a parking meter, and it has nothing to do with Marcus Vane. She was, she thought, going to be okay. Not yet. But eventually. Mom? It was Emma who broke the formality between them. Up until December, Victoria's contact with Jackson had been calls and occasional coffees, always purposeful, always connected to the practical management of the situation. He would check in, she would update him, they would talk, sometimes for a while, about things adjacent to the situation and then about things not connected to it at all. Business, the city, things they'd read, places they'd been. There was a growing ease between them that neither of them acknowledged directly, because acknowledging it directly would have required a conversation neither of them was ready for. Then one Saturday, Jackson called and said, almost apologetically, "Emma wants to know if you want to come to the park." Victoria paused. "The park?" "She saw Biscuit's leash and it's a whole thing. She's been campaigning for 20 minutes. A beat. "You don't have to. I told her you might be busy." Victoria looked around the corporate apartment. She had been sitting on the couch with her laptop, working through financial projections that did not urgently need doing on a Saturday. The apartment was comfortable and clean and completely impersonal. She had not added anything to it in the weeks she'd been living there. No photographs, no particular signs of habitation beyond the coffee she made each morning. "The park sounds fine," she said. Riverside Park in December had a specific bare-boned kind of beauty. The trees all structure and no softness, the Hudson gray and wide. The path mostly empty except for the particular population of city people who exercised outdoors regardless of temperature. It was cold, in the low 30s, and the sky was the flat white of a day that had decided against both sun and clouds. Emma arrived at the park entrance with Biscuit on a leash that she was managing with great seriousness and a level of physical effort that suggested Biscuit had opinions about direction. She was wearing a purple coat and the sideways hat and a scarf that had been wound around her neck approximately 3 times too many, and she looked at Victoria with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to be subtle about curiosity. "You're Victoria," she said. "I am," Victoria said. "Dad said you were his friend." "That's right." Emma considered this. "He doesn't have very many friends," she said. "He has a lot of people he knows from work, but that's different." Jackson, walking slightly behind his daughter, made a face that was partly acknowledgement and partly the resigned expression of a parent who has learned that small children will simply say things. "Emma," he said. "What? It's true. Yes, it's technically true." He looked at Victoria. "Sorry, she's in a phase where honesty and tact are mutually exclusive." "I think it's fine," Victoria said. She looked at Emma. "I don't have very many friends either. I have a lot of people I know from work, too." Emma seemed to find this satisfactory. She turned her attention back to Biscuit, who had identified something of interest in a bush and was expressing his feelings about it with his whole body. "Biscuit," she said in the tone of someone addressing an unreasonable adult, "we are not investigating every single bush. We have discussed this." Biscuit ignored her. "He's not listening," Emma reported, as if this were new information. "He never does," Jackson said. "That's because he's thinking," Emma said firmly. "He listens. He just has his own conclusions." They walked for an hour. The path wound along the river, the water dark and cold beside them, the far bank of New Jersey sitting low in the distance. Emma walked between them for most of it, conducting parallel conversations, one with Biscuit, one with the general air about the things she was seeing, one with her father about something that had happened at school involving a project about ecosystems that she felt had been unfairly judged. Victoria walked and listened and said things when things occurred to her to say. And what she noticed, without making a big thing of noticing it, was how different this felt from the social engagements she had spent years attending. Those events had required constant management of image, of conversation, of the specific performance of being Victoria Sterling in a room full of people for whom she was always, on some level, a figure to be assessed. This was just a park. A cold Saturday in a park, with a man and his daughter and a dog who had personal opinions about bushes. Nobody was assessing her. She felt the difference in her shoulders, and the fact that she'd been walking for 40 minutes and hadn't checked her phone. At some point, Emma had migrated to walking beside Victoria and had, without prelude or ceremony, taken her hand. Not asking, not making it significant, just reaching over and taking it the way small children take the hands of adults they've decided are acceptable. Victoria looked down at the small, purple-gloved hand in hers and felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't have named if asked. She looked up at Jackson, who was watching this with an expression she couldn't fully read, something careful and complicated, mostly held back. He looked away at the river. "Emma, let the woman walk," he said mildly. "She doesn't mind," Emma said with complete certainty. Victoria tightened her hand slightly around Emma's. "She doesn't mind," she confirmed. The legal situation with Marcus resolved in January in the specific way that such things resolve when the person being threatened stops flinching. Victoria's lawyer, fully briefed and fully resourced, had gone to Marcus's lawyer with documentation of her own, the police report, a record of his calls and texts, Dana's witness statement from the apartment confrontation, and had made it clear, in the particular language that lawyers speak to each other, that any escalation of the regulatory matter would be met with a full accounting of Marcus's conduct that would be significantly more damaging to him than anything he could construct about her. Marcus was not a stupid man. He understood asymmetric risk. He had chosen Victoria as a target partly because of her vulnerabilities, and when those vulnerabilities were addressed and she stopped being isolatable, the calculation changed. The engagement was terminated, publicly, through a terse joint statement that attributed it to a mutual decision and said nothing further. Marcus Vane moved on with his life in the way that men like him move on. To the next thing, the next person, the next arrangement that suited him. Victoria didn't expect him to disappear entirely, and she didn't expect the end of the legal maneuvering to mean the end of the fear. Claire had warned her about that. The legal situation resolving doesn't mean your nervous system resolves on the same timeline, Claire had said. Those are separate processes. Give yourself the time they each need. She did, or she tried to. There were bad days in January and February where the space the relationship had occupied, the terrible constrictive space of it, the space she'd organized her whole internal world around for 2 years, felt like an absence that she didn't know how to fill. She'd spent so much energy managing Marcus, anticipating him, adjusting herself to him, that without that the days sometimes felt shapeless. She told Claire this. Claire said, "That's the other thing it stole from you, time and energy and attention that could have been yours. You're getting it back. It'll feel strange before it feels like yours." She told Jackson this too, one evening in February when they developed the habit of talking on the phone while he was driving home from his office and she was making dinner in the corporate apartment. She'd started cooking, which she hadn't done in years, mostly because it required no performance and produced something concrete and edible. He was quiet when she said it, the comfortable quiet she'd come to recognize. "What do you do," he said finally, "when you have a day like that?" "Walk, usually. Call Claire if it's bad. Sometimes just sit with it until it passes." "Does it pass?" "Yeah." A pause. "Faster than it used to." "That's something." "It is." She turned something in the pan that sizzled satisfyingly. "What do you do when it's a bad day?" He was quiet for a moment. "Watch Emma sleep sometimes. I know that sounds—" "It doesn't sound anything," she said. "She snores," he said. "Just slightly, and Biscuit snores more. So the room sounds like two people who've had a very satisfying day and have completely no regrets about going to sleep at 8:30. Victoria smiled at her pan. "And that helps?" "Yeah," he said simply. "It helps." In March, Claire asked Victoria if she'd be willing to speak to a small group of women at the Meridian. Not a formal speech, not her full story, just 20 minutes of honest conversation with women who were in earlier stages of the same process she'd been through. Victoria sat with the question for almost a week before she said yes. She had not spoken publicly about any of it. The engagement, the abuse, what had happened. The public story was the terse joint statement from January and nothing more. The people in her professional world had their theories, she knew, and she'd deliberately not fed those theories because she wasn't ready, and also because she didn't owe them her pain. But these were different women. In the third week of March, she sat in a circle of 8 women in the comfortable room at the Meridian, the one with the mismatched chairs and the window onto the garden, which was just barely beginning to show things again, small green points of something pushing through the brown, and talked. She didn't talk about Marcus by name. She talked about what it felt like to be inside it, the specific erosion of trust in your own perceptions, the way each small accommodation had seemed reasonable at the time, the way she'd understood intellectually what was happening long before she was able to act on that understanding. She talked about standing in the rain and not knowing where to go. She talked about a diner at midnight and a card with a phone number and the first time in 2 years she'd told the truth to another person. The room was very quiet while she talked. Afterward, a woman across the circle. Young, early 20s, dark circles under her eyes, hands folded tightly in her lap, looked at her and said, "You didn't look like someone it could happen to." "That's kind of the point," Victoria said. "That's what he was counting on, that I didn't look like someone it could happen to, and neither did he. And so the space between us was invisible." The young woman nodded slowly. Something shifted in her face. Victoria drove back to the corporate apartment that afternoon through streets that were just beginning to feel the first tentative suggestion of spring. Not warm yet, still gray and thin, but the light lasting a little longer, the cold having a slightly different quality to it. She sat in traffic on the West Side Highway and thought about those 8 women in that circle and the particular weight of the room when she'd been talking, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not performance, not the managed version of herself that she deployed in professional settings. Just presence. The particular aliveness of having been completely honest in a room full of people and having that honesty land somewhere useful. She called Claire when she got back. "How was it?" Claire asked. "Hard," Victoria said. "And good." She paused. "I want to do it again." But spring arrived for real in April, the way it does in New York after a long winter. Suddenly, aggressively, as if the city had been waiting for permission. The park turned green practically overnight. People came out of their apartments blinking in the sun like they'd forgotten it existed. The outdoor tables went up at restaurants and were immediately occupied by people who were technically still too cold but refused to admit it. Jackson and Victoria had a recurring Saturday morning in April and May. Coffee from a cart, the park. Emma and Biscuit conducting their ongoing negotiation with the physical world. It had started as something occasional and become, without being declared, something regular. Neither of them named it as a routine because naming it would have required a different kind of conversation. One Saturday in April, Emma, who had grown comfortable enough with Victoria's presence to operate completely naturally around her, had been explaining a dream she'd had in which Biscuit could talk but chose only to speak in questions. "Like what kind of questions?" Victoria asked. "Like, have you considered whether this bush is different from yesterday's bush? Or, what exactly do you mean by home?" "Philosophical questions," Victoria said. "Yes," Emma nodded firmly, "because I think deep down Biscuit is a philosopher." Jackson was watching his daughter with the expression Victoria had come to know. That particular combination of love and amusement and the faint background worry that she thought was probably just the permanent state of being a good parent. "You're raising a very strange child," Victoria told him. "I know." He said it with complete satisfaction. "She's going to be excellent." Victoria looked at Emma, who had crouched down to have what appeared to be a private conversation with Biscuit about a pigeon. She thought about what she'd been like at 7. Quieter, more careful, already learning to read rooms, to adjust, to be the version of herself that made things easier for the people around her. She was 40 years old in 2 months, and she was still, some days, unlearning that. "Can I ask you something?" she said to Jackson. "Sure. Your marriage. You mentioned it fell apart. You've never really—" She paused. "You don't have to tell me anything. I'm not asking because I think I'm owed it. I'm asking because you know everything about my last 2 years, and I know almost nothing about yours." He was quiet for a moment. watched Emma stand up and inform Biscuit that the pigeon was not worth pursuing. Her name was Catherine, he said. We were together for 5 years, married for 2 of them. Emma was born in the 2nd year. He paused. It wasn't dramatic. That was almost the problem. He stopped. We wanted very different things, and by the time we were honest about that, we'd already built a life around each other, an unwinding that was... He shook his head slightly. It was expensive in every way you can mean that word. Is she? She moved to Seattle. She has a life there. She sees Emma in the summers, calls on birthdays. He said it plainly, without particular bitterness or particular warmth. Emma's okay. She's better than okay. Kids are... He looked at his daughter. Emma knew before I did that the situation was what it was. She'd made her peace with it by the time I finished making mine. You've been alone since then. He looked at her. Yes. By choice? He thought about it genuinely, not rushing to the comfortable answer. Partly choice, he said. Partly easier. Partly... He paused. I was so focused on getting Emma settled and the company through a difficult period that it was genuinely fine for a long time to just be doing those 2 things. Another pause. And then it stopped being fine. But by then I'd gotten out of the habit of letting people close, so... He lifted a shoulder. Victoria nodded slowly. She understood that more precisely than she could have a year ago. We're a pair, she said quietly. He looked at her with something that was almost a smile. We really are. In May, Victoria found her own apartment. It took 3 months of looking on and off because she'd been deliberate about it. She wasn't going back to her old building, didn't want to. She found a place on the Upper West Side, 2 blocks from Riverside Park, a pre-war building with high ceilings and windows that faced east and got the morning light. It wasn't as large as her previous apartment. It was considerably more expensive per square foot because of the neighborhood. She didn't care about either of those things. What she cared about was that when she walked through it the first time, it felt like a space she could breathe in. She signed the lease on a Tuesday afternoon, stood alone in the empty apartment afterward, and called Jackson. I found a place, she said. Yeah, where? She told him. That's 2 blocks from the park, he said. I know. A pause. That's our park, he said. He said it lightly, but not entirely lightly. Yes, she said. It is. She could hear something in the following silence that neither of them was ready to name yet. They'd been careful with each other in that way. Very careful, almost overly careful, about the space between friendship and whatever was growing in the gaps of friendship. Victoria was careful because she was still, some days, not completely certain of her own perceptions. Jackson was careful because he was the kind of man who didn't rush things he thought mattered. You want help moving? He said. I have professionals for that. I know. I meant the other kind of help, the kind where someone comes over afterward and tells you the couch is in the wrong place. Emma would tell me the couch is in the wrong place. She absolutely would. She has strong opinions about furniture arrangements. I don't know where that came from. Victoria looked around the empty apartment, the bare floors, the walls blank and full of possibility. The east-facing windows already warming in the late afternoon light that came through them at a low angle. Jackson, she said. Yeah. Thank you for... I know I've said it. I know I've said it a lot, but I mean it every time. He was quiet for a moment. I know you do. She paused. This year has been the worst year of my life, and also somehow the one where I figured out the most. I don't know how those things can be true at the same time, but they are. They usually are, he said quietly. Claire said something last week. In our session, she said, Victoria stopped, put it together. She said that the people who come out the other side of this, they don't come out unchanged. That's not what happens. What happens is they come out knowing themselves better, knowing what they need, what they can't live without, what they won't compromise on. She looked out the east-facing windows. I didn't know those things before. I thought I did. I thought I was very clear-headed about my own life. And now? Now I know I'm someone who needs to be told the truth, even when it's inconvenient. Who needs space that's actually mine? Who needs people around her who aren't adding to the noise? She paused. And I know I need to stop thanking people for the basics of human decency like it's a luxury. That one's taking longer. Take the time it takes, he said. But the week before Victoria moved into her apartment, she went back to the Meridian. Not for a session this time. Claire had asked if she'd be willing to take on a more regular role, not as a counselor, she had no training for that, but as something Claire had started calling a community bridge, someone who came in once a month and talked with women in the earlier stages, someone who was proof of the other side. Victoria stood in the garden behind the brownstone, small, urban, nothing grand about it, but full of things growing in the May warmth, and talked to Claire about it. The garden had come fully alive since November. The roses she'd seen as frozen canes from the window that first day were flowering, deep red, improbably vibrant against the gray brick wall. I'm not a success story, Victoria said carefully. I don't want to be positioned as a success story. You're not, Claire said. You're a person who's still in the middle of it, who can speak honestly about what that middle looks like. That's more useful. I still have bad days. I know. There are still times I second-guess things. Decisions. Whether my read on a situation is accurate or whether I'm still... She paused. Whether Marcus's voice is still in your head, Claire said. Yes. It'll be there for a while, Claire said, simply, without flinching. The work is learning to hear it as his voice, not yours, not truth. Victoria looked at the roses against the brick wall. It's getting easier to tell the difference, she said. Yeah. Claire smiled, a real one, slightly crooked. It does. They stood in the garden for a while in the May morning, the city noise going on around them, the roses doing their completely indifferent and beautiful thing. Victoria thought about November, about standing in the rain not knowing where to go, about a diner at midnight and coffee going cold, about how far that felt from this garden in the sunshine, and also how directly it connected. Not a break in the line, but a continuation of it. The same line running through every bad day and hard conversation and small, incremental shift until it arrived here. She was not fixed. She was not finished. She was still, as Claire would say, in the middle of it. But the middle of it felt like a different thing than it had in November. Less like something closing around her. More like something opening up. On a Saturday in late May, Victoria moved into her apartment. The movers were done by early afternoon. The boxes were in their approximate right rooms. The couch was in what Victoria thought was probably the right place. The east-facing windows caught the afternoon light at a low angle and turned the bare floors warm and gold. Jackson and Emma showed up at 4 o'clock with a plant, a small, sturdy succulent in a terracotta pot, chosen by Emma, who had apparently researched the subject and determined that succulents were, in her words, basically impossible to kill, which is good for beginners. I'm not a beginner, Victoria said. You said you'd never kept a plant, Emma said reasonably. That doesn't make me a... Victoria looked at Jackson. She's not wrong, he said. Victoria looked at the succulent. It sat in its terracotta pot, looking compact and entirely self-sufficient, which she found oddly appealing. Thank you, Emma, she said. Emma nodded with the gravity of someone who has completed a mission. She then walked through the apartment with Biscuit, conducting what appeared to be an inspection, and returned with her verdict. The couch was in the wrong place. The couch needs to face the window, she said. It faces the room, Victoria said. But the window has the view, Emma said, as if this were self-evident. Victoria looked at the couch, looked at the window, looked at Jackson, who had the very specific expression of a person trying not to look like he had an opinion. You have an opinion, she told him. I said nothing. Your face said something. He broke. The window is better, he said. She's right. I'm sorry. Victoria moved the couch. The three of them sat in the rearranged living room in the late afternoon, Emma on the floor with Biscuit, making up a detailed story about what Biscuit would do if he ran a bakery. Jackson and Victoria on the couch that now faced the windows, the east-facing glass full of the long golden light of a May evening settling over the city. It was a very ordinary thing. A couch, a window, a child on the floor talking to a dog, the city outside going about its business. Victoria sat with her coffee and watched the light move and felt, carefully and without pushing at it too hard, something that might have been contentment. Not the complete, uncomplicated kind, The kind with edges and history and work still to do, but real. That was the thing. It was real. Summer came in hot and stayed that way. June in New York was the month that separated the people who loved the city unconditionally from the people who loved it with conditions. And this particular June was the kind that tested everyone. The heat sat on the streets in visible waves. The subway platforms were a specific kind of miserable that required a certain philosophical acceptance. Central Park filled with people who had decided that being outside in 90-degree heat was still preferable to being inside with whatever their apartment situation was, which said something about New York apartments. Victoria had bought a window unit for her bedroom and was locked in an ongoing negotiation with it about temperature. The living room, with its east-facing windows, was tolerable in the mornings, and then increasingly not tolerable as the afternoon progressed. She'd started doing most of her work at the small desk near the window before 9 a.m. and then retreating to the kitchen table, which got cross-ventilation from the hallway, which was almost adequate. It was the most mundane domestic problem she'd had in years, and she found it genuinely a relief. The succulent Emma had given her was on the windowsill and appeared to be thriving in conditions that Victoria herself found difficult. She'd named it, quietly and without telling anyone, Gerald. Gerald asked nothing of her, offered no opinions on her decisions, and was visibly contentedly alive despite minimal intervention. She found this relationship extremely satisfying. Her company was in the best shape it had been in 3 years. The proactive disclosure her lawyer had recommended, a careful, controlled acknowledgement of certain early decisions, framed with appropriate context and remediation steps, had gone better than expected. The board had been less alarmed than she'd feared. 2 of them had come to her privately afterward and said they respected the approach. The stock had dipped briefly and recovered. The analysts who covered her sector had written, with the particular confidence of people who hadn't known what was happening at the time, that Victoria Sterling had handled a complex regulatory moment with characteristic composure. She'd read that piece on a Tuesday morning and laughed until her eyes watered. The characteristic composure. They had no idea. She was still doing the monthly sessions at the Meridian. Claire had started calling her an asset, which Victoria had pushed back on. She was very conscious of not wanting the work she did there to become part of her professional identity, another line in a press release, another demonstration of her personal brand. It was something she did because it mattered, and because the women in those circles deserved honesty, not performance. The moment it became performance, she'd stop. She told Claire this, and Claire had said, "I know. That's exactly why you're good at it." On a Thursday evening in late June, she was sitting at her kitchen table with a glass of wine and a quarterly report she was annotating in the margins when it occurred to her to write the letter. She didn't know where the impulse came from exactly. She'd been thinking about the anniversary. It would be almost a year in November since the night of the gala, since the rain, since the diner. She'd been thinking about that in the abstract way she sometimes thought about it, the way you think about a thing that changed the shape of your life without entirely being able to hold the full weight of what that means. She got a legal pad from the drawer. A real one, yellow, the kind she used in meetings when she didn't want to type. She found a pen. She sat for a while looking at the blank page. Then she started writing. She didn't show it to anyone, not Claire, not the women at the Meridian. She wrote it over several evenings, not continuously, but in the way that things get written when you're trying to say something true rather than something impressive. She'd write a paragraph and put it down, come back the next night and reread it and cross out the parts that sounded like a speech, and replace them with the parts that sounded like what she actually meant. The first draft was 6 pages. The 4th draft was 2.5. She wasn't entirely sure what she was going to do with it when it was done. She knew she wanted Jackson to have it. She was less clear on the how and the when, and she was vaguely aware that the letter was also doing something else. It was forcing her to articulate things she had been living with but not fully examined. The particular clarity of having to write something down, to put it in order, to make it coherent for another person, was doing work on her that she hadn't expected. She wrote about the rain, about sitting in his car not knowing whether she could trust her own decision to get in. About the diner, the 2 bright lights, the coffee that went cold while she talked. About the specific moment he'd said that's not a relationship, that's a management strategy, and what it had felt like to hear something she'd known in some wordless part of herself and had never heard stated plainly out loud. She wrote about Claire, about Dana, about the police report, and the 4 hours it took and sitting on that precinct step afterward with the particular solidification of something finally existing outside her own head. She wrote about Emma taking her hand in the park. She spent a long time on that paragraph. She crossed it out twice and rewrote it both times because she wasn't trying to make it sentimental. It wasn't sentimental, it was just true. And the truth of it was that the small, uncomplicated trust of a 7-year-old had undone something in her that 2 years of deliberate adult cruelty had done. She didn't know how to say that without it sounding like too much, but she tried anyway. She wrote about what she understood now that she hadn't before, about the difference between the life she'd been managing and the life she was starting to actually inhabit, about what it meant to be in a room and be completely herself, without calculating what version of herself the room required. She wrote, "Before that night, I knew how to be successful. I did not know how to be safe. I had confused those two things for so long that I'd stopped noticing they were different. You helped me notice." She looked at that sentence for a long time before she decided to leave it in. The last paragraph took her 3 evenings. She started it 4 different ways. The 4th way was the right one, and when she finished it, she put the pen down and read the whole thing through once, and it wasn't perfect. There were sentences that were still slightly clunky, still slightly too formal in places, but it was honest. It was the most honest thing she'd written since she couldn't remember when. She folded it into thirds, put it in an envelope, and wrote his name on the front. Just Jackson. Nothing more. Then she put it in the drawer with the legal pad and left it there for 6 weeks. The reason she left it there for 6 weeks was not that she'd changed her mind. It was that she was working out, slowly, something more complicated. She was in love with him. She'd known this, in the background, for several months. Not the sudden kind. Nothing about this had been sudden. Everything about it had been slow and careful and built on 1,000 small, honest moments. But the kind that arrives gradually, that you recognize one day not because something new happened, but because you've been living with it long enough that its shape has become familiar. She was in love with him, and she was frightened of it. Not in the way she'd been frightened of Marcus. Nothing like that. It was a different kind of fear. The fear that comes not from danger, but from the stakes of wanting something real. She had been badly enough damaged that she did not entirely trust her own instincts about men yet. She'd told Claire this. "That's fair," Claire had said, which was not the response Victoria had been hoping for. It takes time to trust your instincts again after they've been systematically overridden. But I want to ask you something. When you're with Jackson, does he ever do anything that makes you feel the way Marcus made you feel? Victoria thought about it seriously. No. Not in small ways, not even slightly. No. She was certain about this. She paused. He's the opposite. He does this thing where he just waits. He never pushes. He never asks me to be anything I'm not being. If anything, I'm more myself with him than I am alone. Then what are you afraid of? That I'm wrong, Victoria said. That I've convinced myself he's safe because I want him to be safe, and I've been wrong before about what people are. Claire was quiet for a moment. You were wrong about Marcus because Marcus worked very hard to make you wrong. He was deliberate about what he showed you and what he hid. That's not the same as your judgment failing you. She paused. Has Jackson ever hidden anything from you? Victoria thought about the kitchen conversation in the park. My marriage fell apart. I work too much. I'm not always present with Emma the way I want to be. The particular quality of that honesty, the way he'd offered his own imperfections with the same plainness he offered everything else. No, she said. Your instincts about him are probably right, Claire said, but I understand not being ready to act on them. That's also okay. So she left the letter in the drawer. She went on with her summer. She went to the Meridian. She ran her company. She had Saturday mornings in the park with a man who waited without pushing and a 7-year-old who had, by July, begun referring to Victoria as my dad's friend Victoria, with a proprietary emphasis on my that made Jackson look at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had lost control of a specific narrative. She had dinners with Jackson, occasionally, the kind that started as practical. They were both in the neighborhood, they were both going to eat, it was efficient, and became something else, longer and later and more easily honest as the summer progressed. He'd come to her apartment sometimes, or she'd go to his, and they'd cook or order in and sit at the table talking about things that had nothing to do with the situation they'd been inside together, which was itself a kind of development. They talked about books they'd read and things that irritated them and what they thought about various people they knew professionally and the specific question of whether Biscuit was genuinely intelligent or performing intelligence, which was a debate they'd been having for months without resolution. She was, she thought, happy. In the careful, eyes-open way that she was learning to be happy. Not the blind happy of before, which had been partly performance, but the kind that acknowledged its own complications and was happy anyway. In August, she took the letter out of the drawer. Gerard. She called him on a Tuesday evening in the second week of August. "I want to take you somewhere," she said. A pause. "Okay. Where?" "The Blue Anchor," she said. "Friday night." He was quiet for a moment that lasted just long enough for her to understand that he remembered, that he recognized as she did, the particular weight of that choice. "Yeah," he said. Okay. Friday was warm in his way of late summer, the air still soft, the city at that specific end-of-summer mood that's partly melancholy and partly relief, the knowledge that the heat was almost over sitting somewhere in the air alongside the heat itself. They walked to the diner from her apartment, which was close enough. The evening was the kind you walked through rather than rushed, and they walked slowly and talked about nothing in particular. Something Emma had said that week about the nature of clouds, an article Jackson had read about deep-sea fish that he found compelling and she found mildly unsettling. The Blue Anchor looked exactly the same. The vinyl booths, the sticky menus, the pie case rotating with its patient confidence. Donna was behind the counter, older, same, unbothered by the universe in the same specific way she had always been unbothered. She looked up when they came in. "Anywhere's fine, hun. Coffee?" "Please," Jackson said. "Two," Victoria said. They slid into the same corner booth. The overhead lights were exactly as too bright as they'd always been. The man at the counter was different, but occupied the same posture as the man who'd been there in November, bent over something elsewhere, entirely his own business. Victoria set the envelope on the table between them. Jackson looked at it. Her handwriting, his name. He looked up at her. "What is this?" "Read it," she said. He picked it up. She watched him open the envelope, unfold the pages, register that it was handwritten. 2.5 pages of her slightly cramped, precise handwriting that he'd seen on meeting notes and margin annotations, but never like this. She watched him read. She'd debated whether to watch him read it or look away, and she'd decided to watch because she'd spent enough of her life looking away from things she needed to see. She watched his face move through the letter. Not dramatically, he wasn't a man who expressed things dramatically, but in the small ways she'd learned to read over the past 8 months. The slight shift around his eyes in the second paragraph, the way his jaw moved once in the middle, a single small clench, when she knew he'd hit the part about the lamp and look what you made me do. The stillness in his face when he reached the Emma paragraph, a particular quality of stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. He read it twice. When he finished the second time, he folded the pages carefully along the original creases and put them back in the envelope. He set the envelope on the table. He looked at her for a moment without saying anything. "Say something," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by this. "I don't know where to start," he said. "Anywhere." He looked at the envelope, then at her. "The part about Emma," he said, taking your hand. "What about it?" "I was going to tell her not to," he said. "I started to say something, and then I didn't, and I've thought about it since. Whether I made the right call." He paused. "I didn't say anything because she looked so... She just did it. No agenda. Just because she'd decided you were someone worth taking the hand of. And I thought, Emma has better instincts than me. Don't interfere." Victoria looked at him. "She has excellent instincts." "She really does." A pause. "She talks about you, you know, not constantly, but regularly. She has you filed somewhere important. Is that..." Victoria paused. "Does that complicate things? For you?" He thought about that genuinely. "It could have. It would have, if I'd let it. If I'd used it as a reason to keep more distance, because what if things didn't work out? And then there was Emma to think about." He looked at her. "But I realized I was doing the math backward. I was calculating the cost of things not working out instead of looking at what was actually in front of me." Donna arrived with coffee. She set it down with the efficiency of someone who had been setting coffee down for decades and had no interest in the conversations happening around the cups. She disappeared without comment. Victoria wrapped both hands around her mug, same as the first time, same gesture, same booth. She noticed it and thought she would probably think about that for the rest of her life. "Jackson, I know," he said, quietly, in the way he had of saying things that met her halfway before she'd finished saying them. "I'm not—" She stopped, tried again. Some days I'm still not sure I trust my own read on things. That's getting better, but it's not done." "I know. And I need to—" She paused. "I need things to be honest. I can't do anything that isn't honest. That's not a warning. That's not a warning to me," he said. "That's just who you are." She looked at him in the too bright light of a diner that had become, somehow, the most important room in her life. He looked back at her with the particular attention she'd known from the first night, the attention that had made her get in the car. That quality of actually being there, not managing the moment, but just in it, present, with no secondary agenda she needed to scan for. "I'm in love with you," she said. She said it the way she'd learned to say hard things, plainly, without dressing it up. "I wanted to say it directly because I'm done with indirection." He was quiet for a moment, not a long moment, the length of someone who had been thinking about something for a while and was now deciding to stop thinking and say it. "I know," he said. "Is that all you're going to—" "I love you too," he said. "I've been trying to give you space to get to it on your own timeline because I didn't want to be something else you were navigating. But, yeah." He looked at her without flinching. "Yeah, I do." She breathed out slowly. "Okay," she said. He almost smiled. "Okay? I've been working up to this for 6 weeks. I'm processing. Take your time." "You love me," she said, as if saying it out loud was how she was confirming it was real. "I do," he said simply. "For a while now." Outside the diner, the city did what it always did. Moved and hummed and didn't particularly care what was happening in the corner booth of a diner that had been open since 1987. A cab went past. Someone on the sidewalk was on their phone. The traffic light at the corner cycled through its colors with mechanical indifference. Inside, 2 people sat with their coffee in a booth that had seen every variety of late-night human situation, and they looked at each other in the too bright light, and neither of them reached for a polished thing to say. It was not simple after that. They hadn't expected it to be. Victoria had told Claire about the diner, all of it, the letter, what had been said, and Claire had sat with it for a moment in her professional way, and then said, "How do you feel?" "Terrified," Victoria said. "Good," Claire said. "If you weren't terrified, it would mean you weren't taking it seriously. That's not very comforting." "No," Claire agreed, "but it's true." The terror was specific. It lived in the moments where she caught herself adjusting, softening a statement, reading the room to figure out what version of herself would land best, and having to consciously stop and ask herself whether she was adjusting because the situation genuinely called for it or because she was back in old grooves. Usually it was neither. Usually it was just the habit of it. Grooves worn deep by 2 years of compulsory performance, and the recognition was enough to step out of them. But some days the recognition came late, and she'd be halfway through a conversation before she realized she'd been editing herself. And then she'd stop and say the things she'd been editing out, and Jackson would take it without difficulty, and she'd feel that specific frustration at herself that was, Claire said, also part of the process. Jackson had his own version of adjustment. He had spent 4 years in a carefully managed containment. He knew how to be present for Emma, present for work, present enough in social situations to function. He did not know, particularly, how to be present in the specific vulnerability of a relationship with another adult, how to let himself be seen in the particular way that loving someone required, without the distance he'd been maintaining out of habit and some residual damage from his marriage. He was better at saying the easy things than the difficult ones. Victoria noticed and told him. He acknowledged it and tried. Some days he got there on his own. Some days she had to wait for him to arrive at it, and waiting for him to arrive was different from waiting for someone who might be managing her. It was the ordinary wait of 2 people learning each other's rhythms. They were not always patient with each other. There was an argument in September, a real one. not the polite kind, about something that started as a logistical disagreement about Emma's birthday and revealed itself to be about something else entirely. Victoria feeling, without fully realizing it until she was in the middle of saying it, that she was sometimes on the outside of decisions about Emma's life in a way that she didn't know how to navigate because she hadn't been given a clear understanding of what role she was in. "I'm not asking to be her mother," she said, and her voice had an edge in it that she didn't particularly try to sand down. "I'm asking to understand what I am to her, what I'm supposed to be, because right now I'm doing a lot of guessing and I'm apparently guessing wrong." Jackson looked at her with the expression of someone who had been approached with a truth they weren't quite ready for and was deciding whether to meet it or step back from it. He met it. "You're right," he said. I've been figuring it out myself, and I haven't been including you in that figuring, and that's not fair to you." "No," she said. "It isn't." "I don't know exactly what to call it either," he said. "I don't have language for it that doesn't feel like too much or too little." "Then let's find the language," she said. "Together. That's my whole point." They sat with it for a while. The finding took several conversations, over several weeks, none of them entirely comfortable, all of them necessary. What they arrived at was not a clean category, but a genuine understanding that Victoria was who she was to Emma, which was someone Emma had decided to trust and care about, and that the role would define itself through what they actually did rather than what they called it. That Emma, at 7 going on 8, was not confused by this, even if the adults were, because Emma had the gift of caring about whether people were good rather than whether they fit a recognizable label. Emma herself, when Jackson tried to have a version of this conversation with her, had listened seriously and then said, "Dad, I know who Victoria is." "What do you mean?" "She's Victoria," Emma said. "She's ours." She had the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone who has overcomplicated it. "Can I watch one more episode?" Jackson had told Victoria this later, and Victoria had laughed and then been quiet for a moment and then laughed again and said, "She's ours. She said that." "She did. Your daughter is smarter than both of us." "Yes," Jackson said. "I know." October arrived and the city turned beautiful the way it does for a few weeks every year. The particular brief window when the light is gold and the air is sharp, and the trees in Central Park are burning their slow red and orange fire. Victoria walked to work when she could, taking the long way through the park in the mornings, letting the light and the smell of it and the crunch of leaves under her feet be something she actually noticed rather than background. She had started noticing things again. That was something she'd realized gradually, that during the Marcus years she'd been so focused on managing the internal threat that she'd stopped really registering the external world. She'd looked at things without seeing them, moved through spaces without inhabiting them. Now she looked at things, and they were there, fully there. And the gold October light was genuinely gold, and the sharp October air was genuinely cold, and she was genuinely physically in it. It was such a simple thing, being present. She couldn't have said a year ago how much she'd lost of it until she started getting it back. She was thinking about this, about presence, about how strange the ordinary world is when you're actually in it. When her assistant forwarded her an invitation in October, and the invitation changed the shape of the fall. The invitation was from a foundation she'd never heard of, the Castlebrook Foundation, focused on domestic violence, prevention, and survivor support. They were organizing a fundraising gala in November, the kind of major annual event with a keynote address, and they were asking if she would consider speaking. Not about her company, about her experience. Victoria read the invitation twice, put her phone face down on her desk, picked it up and read it again. She'd spoken at the Meridian. Small circles, private rooms, women in the same situation she'd been in. That was one thing. A fundraising gala was another. Cameras, press coverage, a different kind of public. The joint statement in January had been deliberately opaque. Nobody in her professional world knew the full picture. This would change that. She called Claire. "The Castlebrook thing," Claire said immediately. "I know. They reached out to me too, asking if I had any contacts." "You gave them my name." "I did." Claire's voice was unapologetic. "You can say no, but I thought you should know the option existed." Victoria leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "If I do this, It becomes public. Everything becomes, yes, Marcus will react, probably. Claire paused. But let me ask you something. Is the reason you'd consider not doing it actually about Marcus? Or is it about being afraid of what it costs professionally? Victoria thought about it honestly. Both, she said. Fair. What else? I don't want to do it wrong. I don't want to make it about me specifically in a way that's... She paused. I've seen people take their trauma and turn it into a brand. I'm not interested in that. I know, Claire said, and that's exactly why you should do it. Because the women I've seen do this well are the ones who are most afraid of doing it wrong. The ones who see it as a performance opportunity tend to land differently. Victoria was quiet. You don't have to decide today, Claire said. I know. She decided that evening. She called Claire and said yes, and then she called Jackson. The Castlebrook Gala, she said. I'm going to speak. A pause. Tell me about it. She told him. She heard him listening. The particular quality of his attention that she'd been trying, for months, to stop being surprised by because she kept expecting it to diminish and it didn't. Are you scared? He said. Extremely. Good, he said, and he sounded so much like Claire when he said it that she almost laughed. Everyone keeps telling me that being scared means I'm taking it seriously. Because it's true. He paused. I'll be there. If you want me there, I want you there. Then I'll be there. She spent 3 weeks writing the speech. It went through more drafts than the letter had. Not because the letter had been easier, but because the letter had been private, and this was not going to be private, and the difference in audience changed what she was trying to do. She wasn't writing for one person who already knew her. She was writing for a room full of people who knew the name Victoria Sterling and thought they knew what that meant. She was also, increasingly, writing it for herself. She brought it to Claire one Tuesday and read it aloud, which was something she hadn't done before. She'd written speeches but never read them to anyone before delivery, because reading them aloud felt too exposed, too much like being seen in the making of something. Claire listened with her eyes closed. When Victoria finished, Claire opened her eyes and said, "Cut the third paragraph." Victoria looked at it. That's the part about the statistics, Claire said. I know. The statistics are accurate, and they're not what's going to stay with anyone in that room. She paused. The thing that's going to stay is the thing you said about the diner, about telling the truth out loud for the first time. That's the thing that will make someone in that room feel less alone. Victoria looked at the speech. Cut the third paragraph. She rehearsed it in her apartment, standing at the window that faced east, talking to Gerald the succulent, who was a non-judgmental audience. She rehearsed it until she could get through it without the paper, not because she planned to deliver it from memory, but because she wanted to know it was in her body, not just on the page. On the morning of the event, a Friday in November, almost exactly 1 year after a rainy night and a diner and a card with a phone number, she stood in her bathroom in the early morning light and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. She looked tired. She always looked slightly tired these days, not from exhaustion, but from the specific quality of someone who is working hard on something real. She had lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there last November or hadn't been visible, and her face had a particular quality, open, slightly harder than before, nothing performed in it, that she didn't entirely recognize from earlier photographs of herself. She thought about this woman who had stood in the rain a year ago, not as a stranger. She had no interest in pretending that version of herself had been someone else, the way some people tried to distance themselves from the worst versions of their own lives. That woman had been her, had been frightened and isolated, and had run out of excuses for why leaving wasn't possible, and had, finally, gotten into a car. That woman had made every good thing that followed possible. She straightened her shoulders. She went and made coffee. At 7:30, Jackson texted, "Emma made you something. She says you should read it tonight after, not before." Direct quote, "Tell her before makes you think too hard." Victoria stared at that for a long moment. She typed back, "Tell her I'll wait." She put her phone in her bag. She picked up the speech. She went to do the thing she'd decided to do. The Castlebrook Gala was held at a venue in Midtown, large, formal, the kind of room that held 400 people in evening wear and made them all look like they were in a movie about themselves. The tables were numbered, the centerpieces were elaborate, the auction items were behind glass. The whole machinery of charity event culture was running at full capacity, which Victoria had attended so many times that she moved through it on muscle memory while keeping most of her attention elsewhere. Jackson was at her table. Claire was there too. Castlebrook had invited her as a representative of the Meridian, which was receiving a portion of the evening's proceeds. They sat together through the dinner and the presentations and the early auction with the particular ease of three people who had been through enough together that formal settings were simply formal settings, not something to be managed. At 9:15, Victoria was introduced by the foundation's executive director, a woman named Patricia Harlow, who had the specific energy of someone who had been running on cause and caffeine for 30 years and had no intention of slowing down. Patricia gave a brief, warm introduction that named some of Victoria's business accomplishments and then said simply, "She has something important to say tonight, and she chose to say it here. Please welcome Victoria Sterling." 400 people applauded. Victoria walked to the podium. The room settled. She looked at the speech in her hands for 1 second, not to read it, just to confirm it was there. And then she looked up at the room. 400 faces. In the second row, Jackson. Beside him, Claire, both of them watching with the specific expression of people who already knew what this cost. She did not begin with the statistics. She began with the rain. "A year ago," she said, "I was standing on a sidewalk in Manhattan in the middle of a November storm, and I had nowhere to go. I had a penthouse apartment 4 miles away and a bank account with more zeros than I could meaningfully spend. And I had nowhere to go." The room was quiet. "Not because of the rain," she said, "because of the man who was waiting for me at home." She spoke for 18 minutes. She did not read from the paper after the first paragraph. She looked at the room, not at Jackson, not at Claire, at the whole room, at the 400 faces in the varying states of attention that 400 people occupy when someone is saying something that has weight. She talked about the mechanisms of it, not the dramatic parts, but the ordinary ones, the slow erosion, the way you accommodate and accommodate until the accommodation is indistinguishable from your actual life. She talked about being brilliant and successful and completely unable to trust her own perception of reality. She talked about the specific isolation of having a public life that looked nothing like your private one. She talked about a diner, about coffee going cold, about the first time in 2 years she'd told the truth out loud. She said, "I spent a long time believing that asking for help was weakness. I'd been taught that by a lot of different teachers over a lot of years. The woman my fiancé needed me to be, the professional world I'd been operating in since I was 22. Both of them taught me the same thing. Need nothing, show nothing, keep moving." She paused. "The most important thing I've learned this year," she said, "is that the bravest thing I ever did was get into a stranger's car in the rain because I'd run out of reasons not to." She looked at the room for a moment, 400 people in various states of stillness. If there is someone in this room tonight, or someone you know, who is standing in the rain trying to calculate whether they can trust someone enough to take a step, I want you to know that step is possible. It is survivable. And you will not come out the other side unchanged, but what you come out with is yourself. She stepped back from the podium. 400 people began to applaud, and the sound of it was large and alive in the big room, and Victoria stood at the podium for a moment and didn't try to process it or manage it, just let it be what it was. She walked back to her table. Jackson stood up when she reached it, not dramatically, just stood up, the way you stand up when someone comes back from something. And she sat down next to him, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't need him to. Claire reached across the table and put her hand briefly over Victoria's. Also said nothing, also didn't need to. The applause went on for a while. Victoria sat in it, straight-backed, clear-eyed, not performing composure, but actually composed. The real kind, the earned kind, the kind that had nothing to do with managing anyone's perception of her. She thought about the rain, about where that night had led through all the twists of a year she couldn't have predicted and wouldn't undo. She thought about Emma, at home with Jackson's mother, who had made something that was waiting for her to read tonight. She thought about what it might say, and then stopped thinking about it, because she'd been told not to think too hard. She picked up her water glass. She was present. Fully, entirely present. In this room, in this night, in this life that was still being built, still imperfect, still in the middle of its own story. That was enough. That was more than enough. Emma's note was folded into a square approximately the size of a playing card, and sealed with a sticker that depicted a cartoon dog wearing a graduation cap. Victoria found it in her coat pocket when she got home from the gala. Jackson had slipped it in without telling her at some point during the evening when she wasn't paying attention, and the discovery of it was itself a small thing that undid her slightly before she'd even opened it. She sat on the couch that faced the window, per Emma's very firm instruction from the day she moved in. Still in her gown, shoes off, the city outside doing its late Friday night thing in amber and dark. She held the folded square for a moment. The cartoon dog looked up at her with the serene confidence of a dog who has just received a diploma and considers this entirely deserved. She opened it. Emma's handwriting was the handwriting of a second grader working very hard, large, slightly uneven, each letter considered individually before being committed to the page. It read, "Dear Victoria, I hope your speech was good. Dad says you worked very hard on it. I think you are brave. Biscuit also thinks so, but he can't write. From Emma and Biscuit." Victoria sat with that for a long time. She was not a person who cried easily. She had trained herself out of it for years, because crying in the world she'd operated in was something that got noted and filed away and used, and she'd learned to feel things in other ways, quieter ways, ways that didn't show. But sitting on her couch in her gown at 11:30 at night, with Emma's careful handwriting in her hands, she didn't try to manage it, and for a few minutes she just let it be what it was. She texted Jackson. "I found the note." He was still up. She'd expected he would be. He texted back in under a minute. She dictated it 4 times. The third version had a drawing of you at a podium, but she said the head was wrong, so she started over. Victoria looked at the note again. "I think you are brave." She thought about what it had cost her to be brave, and what it had given back, and how those two things were not separate calculations, but the same one. She thought about a year of Tuesdays in Claire's office, and a year of bad days and good days, and the slow, non-linear work of learning to inhabit her own life again. She thought about standing at that podium tonight, 400 people, the rain in her first sentence, and not flinching. She was brave. She supposed that was true now. Not because she'd stopped being frightened. She was still frightened of things regularly. The fear had not gone anywhere. But because she'd learned at considerable cost that fear and movement were not mutually exclusive. You could be terrified and still take the step. You could have no guarantee of the landing and still jump. She'd learned that from a cold diner at midnight, from a man who asked real questions and waited for real answers, from a 7-year-old who took her hand without asking, and a sister who said you don't owe him an explanation at exactly the right moment. She folded Emma's note back along its original creases. She put it on the coffee table where she would see it in the morning. She went to bed. She slept, for the first time in recent memory, without waking once. The aftermath of the speech moved through Victoria's professional world the way these things move, quickly, incompletely, with the particular distortion that public attention applies to anything private. By Saturday morning, there were pieces online. By Sunday, there were more. The tone of most of them was respectful. A few were sensationalized. One had a headline that made her close her laptop and go for a walk around the block before she could look at anything else. She had expected this. She had prepared for it, or prepared as much as you can for the experience of your private life becoming public property. What she had not entirely prepared for was the volume of messages. They came through every channel: her company's public email, her assistant's inbox, her personal accounts, messages from women she'd never met, from women who had heard her speak at the Meridian, from women who had been in situations like hers, or worse, or different but recognizable, from women who said, "I heard you say the thing about standing in the rain and I understood it exactly." She couldn't respond to all of them. She couldn't respond to most of them. But she read them, all the ones her assistant forwarded, sitting at her kitchen table on Sunday morning with coffee that went cold while she read. And she let them land rather than filtering them through the professional management instinct that wanted to process everything into a strategic response. One message was from a woman who said she had been sitting in her car in a parking garage for 40 minutes on Friday night trying to decide whether to go home, and she'd seen a clip of the speech on her phone, and she'd called a number instead of going home. The message was 3 sentences long. It didn't ask for anything. Victoria read it 5 times. She called Claire. "I got a message," she said, "from a woman who—" She stopped because her throat did something inconvenient. She called a number instead of going home. Claire was quiet for a moment. Yeah, she said softly. That's the whole thing, isn't it? I wasn't expecting... Victoria paused. I wasn't expecting to feel like this about it. Like what? She thought about how to say it honestly. Like it mattered in a way that doesn't have anything to do with me. Like I said, something that belonged to someone else, and she finally got it back. Claire said, That's what it is. That's exactly what it is. A pause. How are you doing? Not professionally? You. Tired, Victoria said. In the good way. The put it down way. Yes. Good. Take the weekend. Don't read anything else online. Come in Tuesday. I will. She put her phone down and looked out the east-facing windows. November morning, gray and cold, the city under a low, flat sky. Almost exactly a year since a night she'd thought was going to break her and had instead, eventually, done something else entirely. She thought about the woman in the parking garage, about 40 minutes of sitting and deciding, about a number called instead of a door walked back through. She hoped she was okay. She had no way of knowing. That was the particular thing about this kind of work. You said the true thing and sent it out and didn't always know where it landed. You had to make peace with not knowing. She made a second cup of coffee and sat with the not knowing and found it more tolerable than she'd expected. Marcus Vane, for his part, responded to the speech the way she'd known he would. Not publicly, because public response would have required acknowledging the speech, which would have required acknowledging the subject of it, which he was not going to do. His lawyer sent her lawyer a letter on Monday that was 3 pages of carefully constructed language amounting to a strongly worded nothing. There was nothing legally actionable in what she'd said. She had named no names. She had been precise about what she could substantiate. Her own lawyer had reviewed the speech twice, and his lawyer knew it, and her lawyer knew it, and the letter was what it was, a reminder that he was still there, still watching, still the kind of man who responded to losing control with the performance of control. Her lawyer called her on Monday afternoon. We'll respond appropriately, she said. This goes nowhere. I know, Victoria said. Are you okay? Yes. She meant it. I genuinely am. She'd expected to feel more. She'd spent a year expecting that Marcus would feel like a larger ongoing presence in her life. A threat she had to keep monitoring, a weight she had to keep accounting for. What she found, increasingly, was that he was diminishing. Not because he'd changed or become less dangerous in the abstract, but because she had changed. The thing he'd had leverage over was her fear, and the fear was smaller than it used to be. Not gone. She wasn't naive about that. But smaller and shrinking. Claire had a term for this. Graduated exposure. Every time you did the thing that scared you, filed the report, left the building, stood at the podium, the fear lost a fraction of its authority. The thing you'd been afraid would destroy you didn't destroy you. The next time it was slightly less powerful. This was not a clean process. It was not linear, but it was real. Victoria was living proof of it. She wrote back to Marcus's lawyer through her own, in 3 sentences, and then she put it in the done column and moved forward. Jackson proposed on a Tuesday in February, which was nobody's idea of a romantic month, in a manner that was entirely consistent with who he was. They were in his kitchen. It was a weeknight, not a special occasion. Emma was at a sleepover at her friend Chloe's house, the one with the 12 puppies that had since been reduced to 8 through the process of rehoming. Victoria had come over after her own late meeting, still in her work clothes, and Jackson had made pasta because pasta was the thing he could reliably make without supervision. They were eating at his kitchen table with a bottle of wine and the particular ease of 2 people who had shared enough ordinary evenings that ordinary evenings had become, without announcement, the texture of their life. He had not planned this particular evening. That was the truth of it, and it was also, she would later think, the most accurate thing about him, that the most important thing he ever said to her came not from a plan, but from a Tuesday. He put his fork down and looked at her across the table. I want to ask you something, he said. She looked up. Something in his voice had a different quality, not nervous exactly, but deliberate in a way that Tuesday evenings were usually not. Okay, she said. I've been thinking about how to do this, he said. I looked at rings. I had a plan, there was a restaurant involved, and a thing Emma was going to do with a note, and he stopped. And then I realized I was performing it, that I was making it into a production because productions feel safer than just saying the thing. Victoria put her own fork down. So I'm just going to say the thing, he said. Okay, she said again. Her voice was completely steady. She realized distantly, not afraid. This was new information. You are the most honest person I know, he said. Which sounds like a strange thing to lead with, but it's the truest thing I can say. And I'd rather say the truest thing than the most polished thing. Mein Bastiket san. He paused. You've taught me more about what it means to actually be in something, actually present, not managing it from a distance, than anything I've figured out on my own. And I want to be in it, all of it. The complicated parts, and the ordinary parts, and the Tuesday nights, and whatever comes after Tuesday nights. Another pause, shorter. Will you marry me? He said it as a sentence more than a question, which was, she would tell Claire on Wednesday, so completely him that she couldn't have scripted it better. She looked at him across the kitchen table. The pasta was getting cold. The wine was open. The overhead light was not particularly flattering. There was no ring visible, which meant he'd either forgotten it or made a point of not having one. And she suspected the latter because he knew her and he knew that a ring produced at a kitchen table with no ceremony was more her than a ring in a velvet box at a restaurant. She would find out later when Emma came home from the sleepover and produced a small box from her coat pocket with barely contained excitement that Emma had been holding the ring for 2 weeks. He kept putting it in different places and forgetting where, Emma explained. So I said I would keep it. I have a very safe pocket. The ring was simple. A single stone, clean setting, nothing that tried too hard. It was exactly right. But that was later. In the kitchen, at the table, on a Tuesday with cold pasta and a bottle of wine, Victoria looked at Jackson and felt the particular quality of a moment she knew she was going to remember. Not because it was perfect, but because it was completely real. Yes, she said. He let out a breath that told her, more than anything else he could have said, that he had not been entirely certain of the answer, even though she would have told him she'd been visibly in love with him for 6 months. That uncertainty, that he hadn't taken her for granted, that even here he hadn't assumed, was so completely him that it made her love him more, which she hadn't been sure was still possible. Yes, she said again, because it felt worth saying twice. He reached across the table and took her hand, not dramatically, just took it, the way you take the hand of someone you're planning to keep. They sat in the kitchen for a while. The pasta stayed cold. The city went about its business outside. At some point, one of them reheated the food, and they finished dinner and talked about entirely ordinary things. Emma's school project, something going on with a client of Jackson's, whether Gerald the succulent needed a larger pot. And it was the most normal evening she could remember having. And it was also the best one. Well, they did not rush the wedding. That was a decision they made together, for reasons that didn't need much explanation between them. Victoria was still in therapy with Claire's referral. Not every week anymore, but regularly, because she'd come to understand that therapy was not something you did until you were fixed and then stopped, but something you did the way you maintained anything that mattered. Jackson had his own version of this. He'd started seeing someone in the fall, quietly, at Claire's suggestion, to work through some of the things the previous 4 years had built up in him that he'd been managing rather than processing. He hadn't announced it. He told Victoria because he told her things now, and she'd said simply, "Good." Emma, when they told her, on a Saturday morning in the park, which felt right, the three of them, and Biscuit in the February cold, had listened to the whole explanation and then said, "So Victoria's going to live with us?" "That's the idea," Jackson said. Emma looked at Victoria. "You can have the room next to mine," she said. "But Biscuit sleeps where Biscuit decides. I don't control that." "I understand," Victoria said seriously. "Okay." Emma seemed satisfied. She looked at Biscuit, who was engaged with something in the frozen grass. "Biscuit, Victoria's staying." Biscuit looked up briefly and then returned to the grass. "He heard," Emma reported. They got married in September. Not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted a large wedding. Both of them had been inside the machinery of large social events, enough to have no appetite for organizing one. 40 people, in the garden of a small estate in Connecticut that belonged to an old friend of Jackson's who had been trying to lend it out for a wedding for years, and was genuinely delighted when someone finally took him up on it. The garden was full of late summer things. Roses past their peak, but still there, zinnias in orange and yellow. The particular warm gold of September afternoon light that lands differently than any other months. Victoria had not hired a decorator. She'd asked Claire to help her think through what she actually wanted, rather than what a wedding was supposed to look like. And what she'd wanted was something that felt like the conversation she'd had in that garden at the Meridian, human-sized, honest, nothing performing anything. She wore a dress that was not white, a deep ivory, almost the color of old paper, simple cut, nothing that required management. She had not hired a makeup artist. Her hair was done by a friend who was not a professional, but who had good hands and better judgment. There was a small smear of mascara under her left eye by the time they got to the vows that nobody fixed, and she didn't try to fix it. And in the photograph from that moment, the one Claire took, slightly crooked, the September garden soft in the background, she looked more like herself than in any professional photograph ever taken of her. Emma was her flower girl, a role she'd accepted with great seriousness and then executed with characteristic pragmatism. She walked down the aisle scattering petals with the focused efficiency of someone completing a task rather than performing one. And when she reached the front, she stood next to Jackson and looked up at him and said, just loud enough for the front rows to hear, "I didn't drop any." There was laughter, the good kind, the kind that softens rooms. Jackson looked at Victoria when she reached him, and his face had the particular expression she had come to know as his most unguarded one. Not composed, not managing anything, just there, completely there, looking at her with an openness that she still sometimes found slightly astonishing in a man who had spent years developing very effective distances. The vows were their own, no script, no borrowed language. He said, "I choose honesty with you over comfort. I choose presence over distance. I choose this, every day, whatever this looks like, the good days and the Tuesday nights, and the days that are hard to get through. I choose you, all of you, exactly as you are." She said, "I spent a long time not trusting my own instincts. The best instinct I ever had was getting into your car in the rain. I'm still here because of it. I will keep being here. That's my vow. I will keep showing up, fully, for this." 40 people in a September garden. Claire was in the third row and did not try to manage her expression, and did not need to. There were things that didn't resolve cleanly, because that's how life works rather than how stories prefer to work. Victoria's company went through a difficult quarter in the winter following the wedding, an acquisition that didn't land the way she'd projected, a board meeting that went long and rough, 2 weeks of 14-hour days, and coming home tired in ways that were harder to talk about than the straightforward crisis kinds of tired. Jackson had his own version in spring, a business decision that turned out to be wrong, the specific humiliation of being publicly wrong about something you'd been confident about, the quiet difficulty of absorbing that without retreating into the management distance he'd been trained out of. They were not always patient with each other during those periods. There were evenings where Victoria was too depleted to be fully present, and Jackson picked up the slack and did it without resentment, but also without entirely hiding that he was doing it. There were mornings where Jackson went quiet in a way that wasn't his good quiet, and Victoria had to decide whether to push or wait. And sometimes she chose wrong. They argued about logistics, who was managing what with Emma's schedule, the particular stress of 2 demanding careers running parallel to each other, the fact that neither of them had fully figured out how to work at the same time in the same space without one of them unconsciously deferring. They worked on it. Some of it got better. Some of it remained a thing they were still figuring out. Emma turned 9 and then 10, losing teeth and gaining opinions at approximately equal rates. She had her father's stillness and her own particular brand of certainty that was entirely hers. She called Victoria Victoria always, never a substitute word, never a title that wasn't accurate. And the relationship between them was not the relationship between a mother and a child, was something without an exact name, and they had both stopped needing it to have one. It was what it was. 2 people who had decided each other mattered, building a thing that had its own language. One afternoon in October, Emma was 10, a school day, Jackson at his office. Victoria was helping Emma with a project about local history. They were at the kitchen table with glue sticks and printed photographs and the particular chaos of a project that had expanded beyond its original scope, which was where all Emma's projects ended up. Emma was cutting something with precision-focused intensity and said, without looking up, "Victoria, did you know that the building I was born in was torn down? I didn't know that. Dad showed me. He said it was there when I was born, and then it wasn't." Emma considered her cutting. "He said that's how cities work. Things go away and other things take the same space, and after a while you can't tell what used to be there." "He's right," Victoria said. "I think that's sad," Emma said, "but also okay, because the space is still there even if the building isn't." Victoria looked at her. At the dark head bent over the glue and photographs, the careful hands, the sideways hat energy that Emma had carried since babyhood, now translated into a different kind of intensity. "Yeah," Victoria said. That's a good way to think about it." Emma looked up. She had her father's eyes and her own expression, and she looked at Victoria with the frank assessment she'd always had, the one that had never been anything but direct. "Are you okay?" she asked. She asked it the way Jackson asked it, not as a formula. "I'm good," Victoria said, and meant it. Emma held the look for a moment longer than necessary, apparently satisfied by whatever she found, and went back to her cutting. Victoria looked at the kitchen, the real kitchen of a real life, flour on the counter from the weekend, a permission slip Emma needed signed sitting under a magnet on the refrigerator, Biscuit's water bowl by the back door, Gerald the succulent, which had indeed needed a larger pot and had been repotted twice and was now an architectural presence on the kitchen windowsill, full of a vitality that seemed slightly excessive for a plant that required so little. The permission slip. She picked it up and signed it because she knew where the pens were and Emma would need it tomorrow. She set it back under the magnet. She sat down at the kitchen table and picked up the glue stick. "Tell me what needs to go where," she said. Emma pointed. They worked in the comfortable quiet of people who have been in enough rooms together that the quiet doesn't need filling, the October afternoon light coming through the kitchen windows at the low angle of the season, the city outside doing what it always did. The following November, 2 years to the month from the night of the gala, the rain, the diner, Claire organized a small event at the Meridian. Not a fundraiser, not a formal gathering, just a dinner for some of the women who had been part of the center's work that year, in the room with the mismatched chairs and the window onto the garden. Victoria came. She sat at a table with 8 other women and ate lasagna that someone had made in the center's kitchen and talked for 3 hours about things that were difficult and things that were less difficult than they used to be. One of the women was someone she'd spoken with in the monthly sessions earlier that year. She was doing well, cautiously, in the particular way of someone who is still building confidence in new conditions. One was a woman Victoria had never met, 2 weeks out of a situation, barely speaking, sitting with her hands wrapped around a water glass and her eyes moving around the room in the scanning way Victoria recognized from her own early weeks. She made sure to sit near that woman during the meal, not across from her, next to her, so there was no pressure of eye contact, just presence. At one point, the woman said quietly, to the table more than to anyone specifically, "I don't know how long it takes." Nobody rushed to answer. Victoria said, "Different for everyone. There's no schedule." She paused. "But it does take. That part happens." The woman looked at her sideways, something in her face that was exhausted and wanting to believe something. "Okay," she said, quietly. "Yeah," Victoria said. "Okay." After the dinner, Victoria and Claire stood in the garden for a while. It was cold, properly cold, November having settled in for real, the bare canes of the roses tied back up for winter, exactly as they'd been when Victoria first looked at them from the window 2 years ago. The same garden, different light. "How are you doing?" Claire said. She said it in the off-the-clock way, not the professional way. "Good," Victoria said. "Really good, with the ordinary complications." Ordinary complications are what good looks like. "I know." Victoria looked at the rose canes, at the bare structure of them, patient in the cold, carrying whatever they needed to carry through winter to get to spring. "Claire." "Yeah. I want to do more, not just the monthly sessions. I've been thinking about, I have resources, I have connections, I know people in law and in finance who could help women in complicated situations navigate the parts that are about money and leverage rather than just the emotional parts. She paused. I want to build something. With your input, under your guidance. Not a vanity project, actual infrastructure. Claire looked at her for a moment. I've been waiting for you to say that for about 6 months. Why didn't you ask? Because it needed to come from you. If I'd asked, it would have been for me. It needed to be yours. Victoria looked at the garden, at the bare and patient roses, at the small, scrappy resilience of things that go dormant for winter and come back in spring as themselves, not as diminished versions of themselves. It's mine, she said. I know, Claire said. Let's build it. Must. Jackson was awake when she got home that night. He was in the living room with a book he wasn't fully reading, the lamp on, the couch facing the window the way Emma had decreed and Victoria had never changed. Biscuit was in his customary position at the far end of the couch, occupying significantly more space than a dog his size should have required. How was it? Jackson asked. She sat down beside him, the familiar weight of the evening in her bones. Not heavy, just full. Good, she said. We're going to build something, Claire and I, something real. He looked at her with the expression she knew best from him, that particular attentiveness, the quality of actually listening that she had decided 2 years ago was the most quietly extraordinary thing about him, and that she thought, now, was the thing she would still be grateful for when she was 80. Tell me, he said. So she told him. The whole shape of it, what she'd been thinking, what she'd said to Claire, the infrastructure she wanted to build. He listened the way he always listened, without managing the conversation or steering it, and asked questions that showed he'd heard not just the content, but the weight of it, what it meant to her. Outside, the November wind moved through the street. The city lights reflected off the low clouds and the particular orange glow of a New York night. The couch was warm. Biscuit was making small sounds that Emma claimed were philosophical, and Jackson claimed were just dog sounds, and Victoria had decided were probably both. At some point, she said, "A year ago I didn't have any of this." 2 years ago, he said. Almost exactly. 2 years ago I was standing in the rain, not knowing where to go. And now. She looked at him, at the lamplit room, at the city outside the window that faced east, that caught the morning light when the morning came, that had been the right window to put the couch in front of, as any reasonable person could have told her. Now I know exactly where I am, she said. He took her hand. The way he did things, without drama, without announcement, just the plain and continuous choice of it. She leaned back into the couch and looked at the city outside the window. She thought about what she'd said to the woman at the Meridian table tonight. It does take. That part happens. She believed that. Not because she'd been told it in the abstract or read it somewhere, but because she had lived it at considerable cost and could stand behind it with her whole self. She had not come out of the last 2 years unchanged. That was not what had happened. She'd come out altered in ways that still, occasionally, surprised her. Things she felt differently now, things she'd had to unlearn. The particular recalibration of a person who has been systematically dismantled and has put herself back together with different tools and better information. She was not fixed. That was not the right word and had never been the right frame. She was not the version of herself from before. That woman was gone, and she didn't mourn her because that woman had been managing rather than living. She was the version of herself that had been built from the materials of survival and honesty and the particular grace of people who had chosen to show up. She thought about what she'd learned, not the clean, summarizable version, the version you put in a speech or on a page, but the actual version, the one that lived in her body. She had learned that asking for help is not the end of something. It is sometimes the beginning. She had learned that the people who will actually show up for you are almost never the ones you expected. They are the ones who ask real questions and wait for real answers and don't use what you tell them against you. She had learned that recovery is not a destination. It is a direction. You point yourself at it and you keep moving, and some days you move a lot and some days you barely move, and both kinds of days count. She had learned at the most fundamental level that she was allowed to take up space, to need things, to be something other than composed. That the version of herself that stood in a too bright diner at midnight and said, "I don't know what to do," was not a failure. She was the truest version of herself she'd been in years, and everything real had grown from that moment of truth. She had learned by watching Jackson that consistency is its own kind of love, not the dramatic declarations, the showing up. Tuesday after Tuesday, the putting down of the book, the real question, the waiting. She had learned, from Emma, that children know who matters to them with a clarity that adults spend years unlearning. She had learned to trust that clarity rather than complicate it. Outside, the wind moved through the November street. Somewhere below, a cab went past, its headlights sweeping the wall. The city turned and hummed and did its perpetual, unremarkable thing. Biscuit made a sound. Emma would have called it philosophical. Jackson would have called it a snore. Victoria, for the first time in her life, was entirely certain where she was. She was home, not because of the address or the square footage or the east-facing window, because of what had been built in this space, slowly, imperfectly, by people who had chosen honesty over comfort and presence over distance, again and again, on ordinary evenings, in the specific and unspectacular way that real things get built. A man who had pulled over in the rain because he'd asked a real question and waited for a real answer. A girl who took your hand without asking because she'd decided you were worth it. A sister who said you don't owe him an explanation at exactly the right moment. A garden with roses that came back every spring as themselves. And a woman who had stood in the rain not knowing where to go and had gone somewhere anyway and had found not the life she'd planned, not the polished version, not the one that looked right from the outside, but the one that was actually hers. That was enough, more than enough. That was everything.